Welcome and good evening. This is June 7th Board of Selectmen's meeting, and I would like to thank our friends at WACA-TV for broadcasting this meeting live to the residents in their homes, and to those who are here in person, welcome. For those of you that are here, if any of you are taping this for your own personal use, would you let us know? Seeing that there aren't any, I would ask that we all stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all very much. I would like to open the meeting by having citizens' participation at this time. If there's anybody here who would like to come to the podium, that would be great. Seeing that people are coming forward. Good evening, Mr. DeSoni.
Good evening, Mr. Mignani, Mr. Chairman.
Last time you can say that, pal.
I know. I would like to, okay then, I would like to say thank you for your time of service in this town, for your position. You put up a lot, have taken a lot, and have understood that the town is growing better in your direction as you has put it with the wards. Last night was a great performance. The Dianza committee was even better. From there, the Dianza made it go on as a committee that can work along with each other, and what was not happening last night.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate those words. Thank you. Good evening.
Hi, Matt Marshquist, 12 Weston Road. I understand you're stepping down. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And thank you for your efforts as the chair. It's been a while since I've been here. I heard you were talking about the multi-use path, so I just wanted to come out. I haven't had a chance to speak at any of the meetings, but I just want to speak in support as a resident who abuts the path. There's one of the locations that's running is just down the street from me, and I wanted to say I'm very much in favor of this path, and I hope that it's built because it's going to be a great thing for my family to be able to hop on this path and go to a state park. It'll probably add 2 years to our lives just from the health benefits alone, not to mention all the other ways that'll benefit the town. So just wanted to add my 2 cents in there. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Hi, Preston Crow, 41 Rockwood. I have long felt, related to cable TV and WACA in particular, that the listings for what programs are coming should be provided as part of the service. And I've thought that you guys, as the selectmen, should require this as part of the franchise licensing agreement. And you also should consider requiring that the channels be HD. My understanding is your negotiating position isn't very strong, and so there is now a bill in both the House and Senate in Massachusetts to require that statewide.
Require what, HD and?
Require that the channels be provided in HD.
Yeah.
And that the program listings be provided so that people could say, I want to record selectmen's meetings, and they would just get recorded. They wouldn't have to know what time and have to go to the WACA website and then do a manual record like we used to do.
You have the bill
VCRs.
numbers by any chance?
I actually do. It is House Bill 2682 and Senate Bill 1857. And I would encourage anybody to contact Representative Jack Lewis or Senator Karen Spilka with a quick email and support. I would especially encourage the selectmen to contact them, giving feedback as to why this is not something we've been able to get locally through the franchise agreement negotiations, because that would give some very good perspective as to why this is needed as a state law instead of something to be negotiated locally. Thank you.
Thanks, Preston.
If anyone would like talking points, I have those available if they email to me.
Oh, good.
I can forward this to you as well.
Preston,
Do you think anyone would admit that they were recording the Board of Selectmen meeting?
There is that.
Well, I actually, having an advanced computer science degree, wrote a program that goes to the WACA website, downloads the listings every night, and injects them into the database for my DVR, so I actually can do that.
That is painful.
But it shouldn't require an advanced degree in computer science to do that sort of thing.
Do we have an advisory? I thought we had an advisory committee. Are they
There's the
getting
board
us
of
ready
directors.
for? Yeah.
Yeah.
Are they getting us ready for negotiations? This
Well,
sounds
I
like
think
an
the last
issue.
time it was negotiated was 2 to 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And I believe it's a 10-year contract.
It's a 10
Oh.
years, so it's gonna be a
So-
little while.
Yeah.
And the advisory committee is only around when you're doing the negotiations.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Thanks.
all right. Thanks, Preston.
But that doesn't mean we can't write individually
No,
and
Well,
push
to
that.
support these
To support
bills,
it.
yeah.
Hi, good evening. Janet Platt, 11 Rodman Road. Thank you all for your service, and Joe, thanks for taking a turn at the helm. Good for you.
Thanks.
And good for us. I'm just here tonight to take a quick moment to ask the board to continue to set clear expectations that the town follow our own bylaws. And I mean this in general, and I think we're trying, right? And I also mean specifically that we follow our zoning code because it's the foundation of our community vision. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Janet.
Janet.
Thanks, Janet. Appreciate it. Seeing that there is no one else that's willing to come up to the podium, we'll go to our next item on the agenda, and it's board reorg. It's a little before 7:10, but that's okay. We can do that.
So first thing I'd like to offer is, certainly, and I hope I'm speaking on behalf of the board here, our appreciation for your service
Thank you.
as chair for the last 2 years. And I think what I admired about your term was the inclusivity and the sharing of ideas, the communication, and so on. So I very much appreciated that, and I think everybody else did. So, well done, Joe.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So regarding the reorg, I've always felt, this is my personal view, that typically there is there's a flow, there's a rhythm to moving through these positions, and typically the vice chair becomes the chair, and kind of flows that way. And I know we've deviated over the last few years, which is fine. That's our decision and choice to make. But I think it would be nice to get back into kind of that flow of because in reality, all of us should be capable, willing, and ready to serve on whatever role is asked. So, with that spirit, I'd like the board to consider appointing Carl as the chair, moving up from vice chair.
Okay. Any second on that, or any further discussion on that?
I'll second that.
Well, I didn't make a motion
Oh,
yet,
you
so
make a motion, okay.
I
Can
just
I add to
offered
your, can I add to your comment?
Sure.
I wanted to thank Joe for his service, and I did want to note that I did watch the Board of Health last night, and there was, I thought, 2 appearances there by people who really set the tone and showed kind of town leadership as a public servant, and those 2 people were Steve Mitchell and Joe Magnani. And Joe, your appearance was classic Joe Magnani. I'll have to say that. And and Steve,
In a good way.
yes,
In a good way, yeah.
And Steve, set the. I thought it was a very good appearance, and that you reminded everybody about why they were there. Actually, so I was just proud of the Board of Selectmen that made their appearance there, and so that's my long-winded way of saying thanks, Joe, for that.
Oh, thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. So I'll entertain a motion unless there's further discussion.
I would like to thank you as well, Joe. I know that how hard you work and how much preparation you put into this, and so. But I would like to add that after all is said and done, you were still out at home.
That's debatable.
No, that's not debatable. Anyway, but thank you.
Oh, thank you, Carl, appreciate it.
I would like to add, Joe, that I would like to thank you for your 2 years of service.
Thank you.
It's hard stepping in sometimes to the chair, but to Steve's point, you had been vice chair for 2 years under me, so thank you for that support, and thank you for your work as chair. And I, too, think it would be appropriate for Carl to move up to chair, so I'd like to nominate Carl Hackinson as chair for the next term.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second that.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? No, seeing they're on, 5-0. Congratulations, sir.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
luck.
you very
Big
much.
shoes to fill.
They are.
10 and a half wide, just let you know.
Well, I would like to nominate Rob Scher as the vice chair for the same reasons that Steve articulated in moving the process forward.
Thank you.
Is Rob interested?
I will accept the nomination. I think it's, I am interested in having a voice in the agenda, as, because I think that's a very important part of what we do on the Board of Selectmen, so, I'd like to do that.
No
so
one said
thank
you
you.
were going to have a voice
I
in the
know,
agenda.
yeah.
We just appointed you as vice chair.
We'll see. Trouble's brewing already.
So Carl made a motion, I
Do
will
I hear-
second.
You second it?
Yep.
Any further discussion?
No.
No? Seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Seeing none, it's 5-0. Congratulations, Rob. We have one more
Yeah.
position to fill, and that would be the position of clerk.
I'll nominate Steve Mitchell for the position of clerk.
Did I do something to
I'm
offend
not sure
you?
he has enough experience to carry it off, but
He's been it before, so
Yes,
No,
I
I think
have,
it
so
may
I'd be,
handle.
be glad
He'll
to
grow
serve
into
as,
the role.
be glad to serve as chair.
as clerk.
Sorry,
That was.
that was, is that a Freudian thing? Is that what that's
Moment,
called?
yeah.
Okay, all right. Clerk.
I'll second that nomination.
Okay. Seeing there's any further discussion, seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Those opposed? It's 5-0 the vote. So congratulations to our new reorg board. I just ask one quick favor of the new chair, if I may. I have something I would like to read, if I may. It'd take 2 minutes. Thank
do
you.
you have a time?
Yeah, my time
think
is
I have
right
my
here. It's
time,
right there.
so.
I've already practiced. It's a minute and 30 seconds, almost. Having had the distinct pleasure and honor and privilege of being the chair of the board for the last 2 years, I just wanted to take this time and take a moment to thank the current members of this board for placing their trust and their support in me as your chair. This board and this management team has done an awful lot in the 2 years. We've had and performed some minor miracles, to say the least, to complete all that was needed to be achieved. Some took a little bit more work than others, but we were able to get some of the goals that we had set forth completed. We still have many more goals and many more other matters to complete for the town. We're gonna make difficult decisions. We're not gonna please everybody. We know that, we understand that, and this board especially knows that after this past year. It was a trying year, but we got through it, and I think the town is better off for it. Ashland future rests on our appointed and elected officials, and to strive to meet our goals and objectives as a town, we have to set new policies for the guidance without having our biases come into these decisions. All of us need to be reminded of the oath that we took when we were elected or appointed to that office. It's important, and if you don't remember, maybe go down to Tara's office and reread it. It should be a reminder for all of us that the bottom line is to keep Ashland moving in a positive direction and making sure that Ashland is a better place for all of us to work, live, and raise our families. I wish our new chair and our vice chair the very best, and I will continue to support all the efforts of this board as just a member now. We still have a lot of work to do. This isn't a swan song. This is just taking and giving me a little extra time, not having to attend additional meetings.
Right.
So I wish you the best. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to serve as chair for the last 2 years. Thank you very much.
Very nice. Yeah.
Thanks again, Joe.
With that, Mr. Chair, it's all yours, buddy.
Thank you. Okay, we have a 7:15, and I think we're actually on time. And our first appearance is Paul Keating, who's going to bring us up to date on some note sales.
We just had a note sale for $365,000.
Yes, beat them.
Actually, you can go to.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that way the people can hear you, Paul.
And see you.
Yes.
Right.
We just had a note sale for $365,000, a band, basically. 290 was for the purchase of Warren Woods, and then 75 towards some work that's going to be done on the middle school roof. This is just to get us through to beginning of the next fiscal year when we either permanently borrow it, we'll pay it off next June anyway if we don't permanently bond it before that. So I just have a few signatures.
What's the interest rate?
So,
Paul?
we had 4 different bids, and the lowest came in at 1.24%. Next one was at 1.25, and then we had 2 at 1.30. East Hampton Savings Bank won the bid at 1.24.
That's a great interest rate. Holy
Very nice.
Any other discussion or questions for
No.
Paul?
No, good.
Good job.
Thank you,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Yep. So just to clarify, the 290 is for the purchase, not of Warren Woods, but of the properties at the Warren Center. Right.
That's gonna be a nice savings, additional savings.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of having a.
Is that pretty much what municipal bonds are going for?
This is a good rate because it's not a lot of money. Now we have the AAA, that helps.
How much did that roughly save the town, Paul, by doing what we just did? Went from 1.24.
Well, if we're bonding, it could be anywhere 2 to 3%.
2-3%, yeah. That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, because it's short term, so it's a little lower interest
Right.
rate, basically.
When we go to
Yeah.
borrow, we'll do a lot more. We want to make it worthwhile.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Nice work,
My
Paul.
thanks to Joe, too. Lindis' friendly face around town hall.
Oh, you'll still see it.
No.
You're not getting rid of
Might
it.
see more of it.
How much now, when are you retiring soon, or how much
Yeah,
long?
September.
End of September, so,
September.
well, thank you for your service here.
Enjoyed my time here. It's almost like I don't want to go, but
It's
Well,
been a
you
couple,
can, you can still change your
I was
mind.
gonna say, you're more than
been a
welcome to
couple-
stay a little
Could run
longer.
for the Board of Selectmen.
Sit around at home like Steve and be a troublemaker.
it's been a couple of years, right, that you've been here?
2
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
2 years. this past one.
Right.
I mean, obviously, we'll do something a little bit more formal as we get closer to that date, but,
Sure.
certainly now, it's a good opportunity as any as we're doing this to, make mention of all Paul's, all that he's done for the town, and, we're definitely gonna miss you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Here it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, next up, we have Town Council is going to give us a legal update for the past year. Ms. Mead?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. It's great to be here in June. Actually feels like June today. So what I thought I would do this evening is I have provided to you a memo that kind of highlights some of the bigger items we've worked on over the last year. But, I see a number of you when I'm here on office hours on Wednesdays, here and there. But I thought to give you a flavor of what I do. Some people say, well, you do office hours, or what do you do? Well, let me give you like a life in the day of office hours of the town council. So today, I walked in the door, and after I kind of figured out what was going on, I met with Josh to talk about an agenda posting issue he had. And then I reviewed and finalized the amendment for the development agreement that the board's going to vote on tonight, and confirmed that everything was copacetic with the developer and the planning office. I then reviewed the SHI unit eligibility regulations and reviewed the policies and contacted DHCD regarding the town's position relative to that. I continued to work on the Cadillac paint issues, which you're going to talk about later on, including the development plan, the Attorney General's application. I reviewed the NOBIS report and discussed with Adam Roy, who's going to be the presenter tonight, the LSP, and reviewed the regulations relating to whether or not the town it was important for the town to adopt a covenant not to sue. I then had a conference with local counsel, a conference call with local counsel regarding a possible complaint against the town. I researched and addressed questions as part of a public records request. I reviewed the scope of services for the downtown engineering and met with the town manager to discuss that. I met with the town manager to discuss the results of the NOBIS report and the issues that came up related to my conversation with the LSP. I conferred with the board chair of the Board of Health. I conferred with the assistant town manager relative to various town bylaws and the interpretation of them. I met with the IT department relative to a new software contract and negotiated that contract with the contractor. I reviewed a contract for the assessors, and I drafted a policy for the DPW. So that's kind of a day for town council.
It's typical.
And a lunch, right, right. So I did that because there are a lot of little things that happen on a regular basis during the week or when I'm here that we don't put in the town council review because it wouldn't make any sense to do that. I'd spend more time doing that than I would doing work. But so here we have the highlights. So I'm not sure how you want to review this, but maybe I thought I would go through them, and if there are any that you want to talk about in more detail, we can do that. So as you know, Cadillac paint has come back up. As I've been working on this, I first started working on this in 2008, which I think is interesting. There, you know, and Ed was the building inspector at the time, and we were working with DEP and EPA and the owner. It's really moving along now, and it looks like it's going to actually come to fruition and get cleaned up, thanks to everybody that's doing their work in town. So I think that that's a really great thing. So you're going to I think, take some votes or at least hear some information about that tonight. So looks like that might actually come to fruition. The Rail Transit District has a whole host of things happening at the same time in it. The West Union transmission line installation is almost complete. We've had some issues with the contractor, the bond company, and just making sure it gets across the finish line. And so that's taken up a lot of Mike Kennefick's time. You all know Mike very well. He does our construction litigation. He's been involved in that intimately in the last 2 weeks with Jen in particular and Greg Eldridge.
Excuse me, Lisa, has that
Sure.
been, that resolution, is everybody confident that that resolution is,
Well, everybody's pressing to have the resolution implemented. Confident, we'll see.
We'll see.
It was a nice day out today, so that hopefully they were out working. And, you know, personally, I have more concern with the bonding company than I have with the contractor. So I think the contractor wants to get this job done, wants to be paid for it. We want the job done, and we want to finish it up.
Maybe
And
cautiously optimistic is
I'm
better expression.
cautiously optimistic about it. Obviously, the amendment to the development agreement that's been vetted through the planning board and is here before the board this evening, that's been done. And I've been working with the town manager on continued discussions with Magunko, you know, about their continued plans or not or whatever, but that's kind of an ongoing conversation, to say the least. Village of Americas, there's some requests for some potential permit modifications. That's kind of an ongoing thing that comes in and out depending on their phase of construction. The public safety facility, we did the bid documents, we reviewed and revised the bid documents relative to the feasibility study that's happening and drafted the right of entries, so that's ongoing. A lot of this has to do with one of the two town meetings, the work that we've done. So the recreational marijuana investigation that we've done and research and proposed bylaws, that we worked with Member Mitchell on that, the commercial vehicles that was adopted not too long ago. We've been working with Mike and his staff on district improvement financing issues. We've had some HR issues related to the payment of police details and the legalities around that and the IRS and whatnot. We did the revolving fund bylaw, obviously the big change pursuant to the Municipal Modernization Act. And we reviewed then and revised the noise bylaw done by the chair. Similarly, the donation bin bylaw last year, or at the end of last year that was done. And that actually involved also stopping a federal court action that we were able to get withdrawn that was filed against the town late last summer. And so we were able to stop that action. We've had to do a couple of opinions related to the conflict of interest for the Human Resources Department and provide advice on that. Similarly, we've provided advice on the wellness program to the Human Resources Department. We worked with the CPA closely regarding their proposals this year to the town meeting, particularly with regard to the anti-aid amendment and their funding requests. We more recently, through some volunteers, have worked out an electronic signature program for releases to help make volunteerism more efficient in town, and to have that be able to be signed online and still be retained in the case of legal action down the road with the IT department. We, pursuant to town meeting, we helped to bring the Wilson Circle and the Preserve at Oregon Road acceptance to fruition. We have addressed 13 open meeting law complaints just since January 1st. Various public record matters since January 1st. There have been a couple appeals that we've had to help resolve with the Secretary of State's office. We, of course, did late last fall the open meeting law, public records law seminar. We've had to deal with various subpoena of records for various department heads. We're working currently on, Mike Kennefic's working on a foreclosure matter at Galani Circle that has a deed restriction on it, so we're trying to keep that an affordable unit, and that's with the Affordable Housing Trust. You're very well aware of the seat versus the Board of Selectmen litigation related to Robert Hill Way. As you know, the last action was that the town prevailed on the motion to dismiss, and that was, motion for reconsideration was filed, and that hasn't been decided on yet, so that's still outstanding.
Lisa, if I can interrupt, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, do we have any idea when that will come forward?
No, we don't, and we're a little concerned maybe that since they decided it, the court kind of pushed it aside. So we're kind of politely trying to prompt an answer on that.
Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt, but
That's
fine.
We've reviewed the regulatory agreement relative to the new apartments in the RTD, which I believe is before the board this evening as well. Then, as you know, there's the West Union Realty Trust versus the Ashland Zoning Board, the appeal of the 40B, and that has a sidekick litigation going with it, the Enyon Hicks versus the ZBA, also that's put on hold pending the HAC matter resolution. We've represented the Zoning Board of Appeals more recently on the 23 Washington Avenue matter, as well as the Conley bus matter. We dealt with the fusion license thing all through the year last year, as you know, and that was finally resolved. Actually, it got reopened and a new license holder, so that's not necessarily a bad result. And we do a regular basis of contract review, RFP review, drafting of RFPs and contracts. I will say that mostly Jen and Mike and Pat take care of that now, and we just mostly do the reviews, not actually the actual drafting of the RFPs themselves. But that's all related to all the construction with the RTD and all the feasibility studies, engineering studies, all of those kinds of typical work, and we do the contract review on most of those as well. I would also add, though, that one of the programs that we've instituted since we've been town council is that we have a set of boilerplate contracts to help try to reduce that kind of time, so that those are the contracts that go out. Now, there's always an oddball that comes up and they want to negotiate a little bit, but generally speaking, you attach the contracts and that's the way it goes. Obviously, we do the town meeting preparation, drafting of the warrant articles, various bylaw changes, going up to town meeting, and then working with Tara after town meeting to make sure that the Attorney General has what they need for their reviews. And of course, we have various employee and human resource issues, conflict of interest matters that we address that I haven't set separately. And we did the work relative to the special legislation for the redevelopment authority, and the research on the dissolution of that, and work with the town manager's office on that.
Thank you, Lisa. Any comments or discussion for Ms. Mead?
Yeah.
Yolanda?
First of all, I mean, it's always amazing to me. I mean, I'm aware of all the stuff that's going on, but when you look at it like this, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of different things that you know your whole team has helped us with, and I think it's been very positive. And I think for me, I think the work that you've done for the community has been very positive and very helpful. So thank you for this review. I'll probably read it again, and thank you for your work.
Feel free to ask me any questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Steve?
So just maybe describe also your staff as well, because we're just not dealing with you. We're dealing with, you mentioned
Right.
Mike, and I know there's several other attorneys.
Sure. So, so more recently, Kate Federoff joined us in January. She used to be the senior assistant city solicitor in the city of Brockton, has extensive experience in labor and human resources law, as well as you know, open meeting law. And so Kate has been an active participant in a number of items in town. Mike Kenefek is a litigator and does a lot of the licensing work. You've seen Mike. He also has extensive litigation experience. You all know Adam Costa, one of my partners, and Adam is a litigator and mostly land use lawyer in town, and does that work. Sometimes you'll see, rarely, but sometimes my other partner, Jay Tallerman, who, while he has a land use background, like I do, is more of a general municipal attorney. He also does litigation. And then oftentimes you'll hear but not see, or you'll hear from Sarah Bellino, and she does most of our procurement, conflict of interest, and contract issues. And so they, the town, various people in town work a lot with Sarah, but typically she's not traveling down to town.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good.
Anything else?
Well,
Just one quick question with respect to all the open meeting law issues that you've had to work on over this past year and actually several years. Kind of curious as to how much money we have spent on trying to cover ourselves with respect to these litigations, and it's just curious because it's taxpayers' money, and I think they have a right to know.
So I don't have that number. I know that the town manager has had staff keep that separate, not the entire time. So I would say that they became really heavy about a year ago, January 2016. But I think that you kept track with them more recently, maybe the second half of last year into this year. So I don't know, Joe, but I will tell you that they're time consuming. There's no question about it. So that's for sure. And if I could, I just was remiss. I also have an attorney we hired in January who's a title attorney. His name's Bob Dignan. And we thought that was really important because of the real estate work that we do in our communities. We wanted to have not just a conveyancing attorney in our office, but actually a title attorney. So Bob helped do the Warren Conference Center transfer and things of that nature. So.
And that went nice and smooth too.
Yeah.
do you have a number off how many hours? So there's you coming here almost usually once a week for
Once a week.
several hours or maybe a whole day?
It depends. So if I stay for a meeting, then it is for the whole day, and I'm busy the whole day.
And then there's a number, you're doing stuff also in addition to when you're
That's
not
correct.
physically here, plus the other attorneys. Is there do we have a round number in terms of hours per year?
We could run that, certainly run the hours per year, and it goes, goes like this, because it depends. So the month of April and May are really busy time periods for obvious reasons, the town meeting preparation and things like that.
All that.
It depends on where litigation is. We're pretty good right now. We don't have, we've kept litigation down, and a lot of that has to do with preemptive work, right? It has outreach on behalf of your administration, and we're at the point where I think that your boards, we're much closer with the zoning board than we have been in the past, and the planning board has always had a really good outreach, and the planning office, and so they reach out to us before they take action typically, and that's helpful. It helps to keep the litigation at bay, if we can. So I don't know. So I typically am here 4 or 5 hours on a Wednesday. I could be here all day. I mean, I could be busy all day long. And then there are things that come back and we hand off depending on what happens.
Maybe you're not the best person to answer, but when do towns start hiring their own town council instead of going out externally, I guess there's kind of, you have to be pretty big because you need that diversity.
That's a
So
big,
it's like-
that's a, you can answer that, Mike.
No,
if you want.
I think, instead of looking at a single attorney, you gotta look at what the
Yeah.
firm brings. And so,
I guess
you'd
that's
be
the-
looking at a generalized town council, but then you would have to hire all of these specialists, whereas if you
You have somebody-
have a firm that
Yeah.
can handle all of those specialties in-house,
Right.
it makes a lot more sense to do it that way.
Yeah. How many communities do you represent? And I'm
We-
sure that Ashland's your favorite, but you obviously have
Well,
other.
Ashland is,
Alphabetically, anyway.
Ashland is, we are our longest serving council in Ashland for all of our communities. We started Ashland 10 years ago, 2007. And Ashland was our first general council community as town council. We now have 14 communities. But, I'm lead council in 3 of those. And then Jay's lead council in some, Adam's lead council in some. So we divide it up. And some that there are communities that are much smaller, that, don't require half as much work as a larger, busier community. So we have a couple of those that are, quite small, and, we go to town meeting and we see them once a year, but we do a lot by email or things like that. So it really depends on the community.
Thank you.
Anything else?
No.
No.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Good to see you
Thanks.
all.
Likewise. Okay, next on the agenda is we're going to invite the planning board up to the table here for a joint meeting. So if you could, thank you,
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
to discuss the Upper Charles Trail. So if the planning board could join us up here.
We also need to open the meeting. Hey, John.
Hey, John.
How are you?
Sheila?
Hey, Mike.
And for the record, it's 7:38, and I'm calling the planning board meeting to order.
I should probably swing that mic around, Preston, so that you have a mic.
There you go.
Okay, Sheila, do you want to bring us up to
I think
date on or Joel
Joel's going to, yeah,
okay, well, Joel is not a member of the planning board.
this is true.
Okay. So also joining us is Joel Arbeitman. If you want to introduce yourself for the record, Joel.
Hi, for the record, I'm Joel Arbeitman, always have been, and Chair of the Ashland Upper Charles Trail Committee.
And you live here in Ashland.
I do. Good to go?
Go ahead.
Okay, first, just a personal comment. I also want to thank Joe Magnani for his service. It's been calm and quiet here on the board for a long time, and I think that's great. And I also want to congratulate Carl and Rob on their new positions. I think it's great, and I look forward to see how that goes.
Thanks, Joel. I've been
you're-
waiting to use this expression for a year, so I can't believe what I'm hearing. But
Okay, there you go.
I don't think anyone else can either.
That's right. Well, I meant it. As chair of the Upper Charles Trail Committee, I want to speak on behalf of the committee, and I just have a few thank yous, and then I'm going to be introducing our consultant, who's the star of the show tonight. I want to thank the Board of Selectmen, who from the very earliest days understood the vision of the value of a trail like this for the community. When completed, this will be a 30-mile-long regional trail for people at home who don't know. That would be used for walking and biking. It's called a multi-use path. And it would run through 5 towns in this area, including Ashland. And our committee's job, which, again, the selectmen appointed this committee of people. We've been at this for over 2.5 years now. And we have great team members on the committee. So I want to thank the committee members themselves. I also want to thank the planning board. We have, again, a consultant we're working with now. We were able to fund that through funds provided to our committee by the planning board, and we greatly appreciate that. It was very necessary. And most importantly, even more than all those great boards, I want to thank the public, because at our last forum, there was a great article in the Metro West Daily News. We are all about soliciting community input. This is everybody's trail, and I said this at the forum, I'll say it again. This is not about one board with a project to do. This is Ashland's project to do, and we are all helpers, including the public, so everybody can get involved by coming to our committee meetings and speaking their mind, first and third Thursdays of the month in the lower level of Town Hall. And you can also, at any time, send us an email, uppercharlestrailcommittee@ashlandmass.com. So having said all these thank yous, I want to introduce the project leader from Alta Planning and Design, Mr. Phil Goff, who will explain the nature. Or did you want to speak also?
Can you do the screen?
Maybe.
Mr. Goff,
Hello, good evening.
Before we start,
Yep.
I think you've probably been reminded of this, but we only have a 20-minute hearing here, so we can't have the whole presentation that
Yep.
you gave last time. Okay, thank you.
Yep. As soon as we get this started, I have a quick, roughly 10-minute
Thank you.
presentation, and then I'm happy to answer your questions. For the record, Phil Goff. I'm the project manager for this project with Alta Planning and Design, a resident of Arlington. And I have a PowerPoint presentation with a handful of slides that should go quickly. I'm not sure, I might need someone's help to tell me. Should I be using the keys on this laptop, presumably? And one of the things I can just start off with as we're getting this booted up is just to echo Joel's comments about the community engagement and the input we've received from the community has been incredibly positive. It's one of the things that I'm very enthusiastic about in working on this project for the past couple of months. Is good turnout is always a terrific thing to see, and lots of positive comments from people. There seems to be a real sort of general consensus amongst community members who are coming to these meetings that they would love to see some sort of additional trail amenity within the town. Of course, the people have different ideas about what that may look like and where it may go, but that's certainly one of the encouraging things for me as a planner who's worked in many various communities, is to see that kind of turnout. So I'll kind of run through this presentation kind of quickly. I sort of jumped into this slide, but just so the Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board have a sense of what we've done and what we do plan to do in terms of our community process. Many of you I know have been part of some of these, but Alta as a team and me as the project manager at some time with our engineering subconsultant, Kleinfelder Engineers, we've attended a handful, not every other week, but we've attended a handful of the committee meetings where we've had some great input, great work sessions there. We've helped to set up a project website that's connected to it's a separate website, but it's connected directly to the town's website. And of course, we have in our scope a number of public meetings. First one attended by about 65 people on March 30th at the community center. And then the follow-up last Thursday, June 1st, attended by roughly 60 or 65 people as well, with a little bit more of a roll-up-your-sleeves session. We had a lot of people marking up maps, and we had different colored dots for people to give us a sense of which of the preliminary routing options that they thought may work well, or those that don't work so well. I know a number of you were at that meeting, which is terrific. Others weren't, so I want to just go through very briefly, go through the various trail route options that we've looked at, and go through that part of the presentation really, and then just open it up for questions and answers. So because of the various options that we've looked at, and I should probably mention, since it's not on there in an obvious fashion, for those looking at it on your map or on screen, color-coded, the green dashed lines are off-road trails that go through wooded areas, sometimes through public property, through private property easements in some cases, and a few spots where there are some old rail alignments, not many. Those are the green lines. The dashed red lines are side paths, and that would be, in essence, wide sidewalks that have the look and feel in some ways of a shared use path, but run alongside
of a road, sometimes within the right-of-way if it's a wide right-of-way, other times adjacent to it. And then the blue dashed lines are the on-road connections, which are inevitable on many of these options that we've included. We try to place them on roadways that have somewhat lower volume and lower speed traffic, but not always possible. So some of these options do incorporate some of those on-road connections. So we've split it up. I'm going to zoom in, and we've split it up into a west, a central, and east Ashland area. Zooming into the west side, we looked at a whole bunch of options. For all intents and purposes, we looked at what we felt were every single possible way to get from point A, which I'll describe here as Hopkinton State Park, to point B, which is really the Sherburne line at the Whitney Street Bridge, roughly. So in looking at the various options, we would narrow down to 2 potential routes that we feel could work on the west third of the town, running from the state park through the Boy Scout, the first one through the Boy Scouts property and some other properties, connecting to Whittemore Drive through some town-owned property, and then a off-road trail connection through the RTD area and connecting to the MBTA access road. Is there a question about getting the presentation up on the screen? Is there anything I can do to
we'll
expedite that? So that was the first option that we've looked at on the western side. The second option really is a route that it tends to be as much in Hopkinton in some ways as Ashland, at least for this portion of the route that runs on a utility easement through parts of Hopkinton State Park over to Hopkinton, and then sort of looping back to Ashland State Park along an old rail corridor, which there are some remnants of south of West Union Street, Route 135. When we move into central Ashland, again, we looked at what we felt were just about every option, both on-road and off-road, and the side path option to get through the central part of Ashland. We know that a key goal is to provide connections into the downtown area, but also, of course, provide a route around or through downtown with potentially a spur, potentially even a loop around the downtown core, but always keeping in mind we want to get from the far west end of town to the far east end of town. So we narrowed down all those various options to 3, one of which really, there's the C1, which kind of runs along the northern end, which incorporates some of a old rail bed next to the Nyanza Cap site and connects through Stone Park via Magunko Road, and then brings us to, in essence, the entry to Wildwood Cemetery on Chestnut Street via Homer. A second and third options incorporate the new path under construction on the MBTA access road, which provides, it will, when done, will provide really nice pedestrian bike access to 135. At that point, we have the option number 2, C2, that connects along a short portion of West Union Street with a combination of bike lanes, shoulders, and some shared lane areas, connecting then to the access point and entry to Wildwood Cemetery via a short portion of Main Street, and then potentially a off-road trail along Cold Spring Brook. The third option that we have looked at and are analyzing, looking at the environmental challenges, et cetera, is C3, which really routes an off-road trail using some existing hiking and walking routes, perhaps widening them with coordination with DCR, of course, and then a path over the incorporating the existing path on the dam, and then what we know is going to be challenging, but certainly doable, we feel, with good amount of permitting, is the possibility of an off-road trail, likely a boardwalk trail that runs through the wetland area adjacent to Cold Spring Brook from the dam up to Main Street and then eventually to Wildwood Cemetery. On the east side of Ashland, we have looked at we looked at 6 or 7 different options in that area, narrowed it down after our evaluation and taking out especially some of the real difficult, narrow, windy roadway connections like, say, Cedar Street, which we did look at and remove that and a few others relatively quickly, and got down to 3 different options, 2 of which incorporate an access way sort of around the cemetery on the north side of the cemetery, right up against really the Sudbury River. We're going to sort of find that sweet spot between between being adjacent to the cemetery, but not too close to grave sites, which we know is important, but not being right up on the river as well, which of course can be challenging for various reasons. We have, to accommodate the grade change, we have some switchbacks to bring one up to the high school property, where we're analyzing 2 different options. One that's sort of a north route around the high school. Second is a south route around the high school, which requires some negotiation with the Devil's Den area, and then connecting to the Eversource transmission line easement to Cedar Street with a little jog, and then a connection incorporating parts of the established Bay Circuit Trail, which is really sort of assigned walking and hiking route through that area on a couple of very low volume residential streets to connect to the Route 126 via the Market Basket. And then connecting to the Sherburne line at the Whitney Street Bridge, which is just off the map in the bottom right, by way of either the Dyke Trail, by way of Butterfield Drive, which is an option, or more of an on-road option, taking advantage of the new bike facilities that MassDOT is developing on Route 126 to connect to Tri-Street, and then for a short portion of Elliott Drive. There's also E3. E3 really kind of comes in, it's on a separate map, because it comes in from the south. This was an option we really want to look at and analyze and ultimately evaluate, which I'll get into in a second. That really this is sort of getting away from downtown and cemetery and high school to some degree, and just providing linkages to those areas with the spur trail, but making connections through the State Park, the Warren Center, parts of Elliott Street, the Warren Elementary School, some local streets, and some would require some easements on some private property in order to connect back to Route 126. That was our third option that, again, we are looking at. One of the things that we're looking at very carefully in all of these, of course, is working with our subconsultant Kleinfelder, who's taken the lead on the environmental analysis. We know a big part of a handful of the routes that I just described are going to be running adjacent to, or in some cases through, wetlands. We know that there is a bylaw here with required 25-foot buffer zone around wetland sites, vernal pools, riparian habitats, and streamside zones. We know we need to take that into account, and there'll be a lot of coordination with the Conservation Commission on this. There is the contaminated sites, mostly around the Nyanza property, that will need to be accommodated. Historic sites, we're still searching records on those, but certainly one is the historic nature of the dam in Ashland State Park. There's some critical habitat that we found in the sort of far southeast corner that we're looking at, and then the coordination related to a lot of these environmental issues with the Conservation Commission. We hope to set up a meeting with DCR, Mass DEP, and potential MEPA filings through some of these segments of the trail. And then there are utilities that there will be some required coordination for some of these easements. So after looking at the different options, gathering the feedback from the community, which was very important from last Thursday, getting feedback from the committee as well. We then, the next step that we are working on really in the coming weeks is Altas taking our initial take on evaluating, in essence, the 8 different options, 2 in the west, 3 in the center, and 3 in the east that I described. We have 8 evaluation criteria that we have worked on and finalized with input from the town and the Upper Ashland Committee related to safety, linkages to destinations, visibility and access, the user experience, ease of construction, property access issues, community support, and permitting requirements. We're going to be scoring these, up to 10 points for each criterion, and adding these up in order to come up with a preliminary score that helps to inform how we move next. After Alta's initial evaluation, the committee and the town will weigh in and we'll sort of see compare their evaluation with ours and come up with final scores. So what we have heard from the community is very important input, but as you can see here, it's just one criterion. It's an important one for sure, but we recognize that some of the trail options that we've looked at, some might be more popular than others, and that doesn't necessarily mean that ultimately after this more objective way of evaluation and scoring, that those may come out on the top or perhaps on the bottom. So just to kind of round out, this overlap a little with that first slide, but we've had the public meetings on March 30th and June 1st. There will be an outreach event that the committee will be doing, the farmers market, in late June, not July, and then sometime in August to be determined. We'll come back with the third public meeting in which we go over and discuss our preliminary recommendations in our draft report, get final community feedback, and then work on the final report beyond that. So that's a quick synopsis of where we're at, and I'm happy to take any questions or go back to any slides. There's probably a lot to take in for those who perhaps weren't at the meeting, especially last week. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Goff. Any discussion, questions?
I do have one question. Looking at the map, where it's broken down as east, west, and central, and looking at Hopkinton, there's a large part of that trail that's in the town of Hopkinton. Are they paying for that aspect of it, or how is that going to go? How's that going to work out?
We haven't gotten to that level in terms of our recommendations, but if a large portion of the trail is in Hopkinton, then I think that there would be an expectation and certainly a recommendation in the report that the town of Ashland work with the town of Hopkinton in order to find the right funding and how much gets contributed by each town.
At the last meeting, there was someone from Hopkinton who's working on their trails.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and
So
there's some level of coordination.
Right? Okay.
Yep.
And his answer actually was that Hopkinton's waiting to see what Ashland does,
Right.
and they're willing to.
Yeah.
Yep.
And actually, the one thing that's a little inaccurate about this map is the blue portion of that trail in Hopkinton actually should be red if you're keeping score. It's really more of a side path that's already been designed and built along Legacy Farms Boulevard or Drive. That's in essence in place. So whatever would be coming into and out of Ashland would plug into that.
And it's actually very nice if you drive up there and look
Oh,
at it.
I've seen it. There's
Yeah.
going to be solar.
Yeah.
I like the compilation map that you gave us from, I take it this is from all the dots that you got at the meeting?
That's it.
That's
Oh, I
great.
didn't grab that one.
It's
That's
real clear what people do like and don't like.
Yep.
Thank you.
Pretty obvious what they don't like.
Yeah.
Any other comments?
One other question, so when you come back at the next meeting and you've done your evaluation of the different ways and the different routes, will you be able to give an estimated budget on, even if it's sort of a broad, per
Yeah.
mile or per quarter mile, or because of this kind of thing, an estimated budget as to what each of these routes might cost?
The level of, and we will be coming up with some really quick, in order to fill out, to really sort of fully understand and fill out the evaluation matrix properly in terms of ease of construction and other things. We definitely will be thinking about real kind of rough order of magnitude costs of what is really required to build portions of the trail for each of the different options. We won't be providing a cost estimate for those that didn't make the sort of final cut.
Right.
So the final recommendation, whichever combination it might be, will include the cost estimates for those sections.
And would you consider, and I don't know, this is maybe a question for the committee, I know the goal is to have one path from one side of Ashland to the other side of Ashland, but as I look at this, there would certainly be a benefit to creating a smaller loop that has a northern and a southern part in Ashland that then goes with that little part of Hopkinton.
Yeah, there's been discussion at the committee level and internally about sort of a primary route that is ideally as much off-road as possible that goes from end to end in town, and having spurs that double back upon themselves to form loops in and around the downtown area, so that someone is able to walk. Maybe it'd probably be about a 2.5 mile loop around downtown, either by foot or by bike. Some of that inevitably will be more of an on-road connection, as you can see in the graphic. But yeah, that's something we're looking at for sure.
Great, thank you.
Anything else? Planning board?
I'll just ask one question. First, thank you, Phil, and the committee. You guys have done a great job. I think this is what we need from a planning perspective moving forward. I love the tie. Quite appropriate, Phil.
Oh, thank you.
Good luck.
Well, it's a bicycle, for those who can't, it's a bicycle tie, is that?
Excellent. Question on, as far as easements go, do we need any easements, or have we only stayed in locations where we've had right-of-way access? And is there certain easements that should be looked at that we can try and obtain?
Yeah, there is in all likelihood, with the final recommendation, there will be some need for easements. We intend for the most significant ones to have some preliminary discussions, whether that's, Alta directly or members of the committee or perhaps Sheila at the town, to sort of gauge at least the opportunities that might be available there. But I think inevitably there will be some spots here and there throughout the recommended route that will include easements.
Okay, so we're tracking them, and we'll get a cost on those as well, I assume?
Yeah. Yeah, we're creating a whole database of the properties in which ultimately the recommended route will be passing through. That's part of the scope of work.
Anything else? Okay, thank you very much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Goff.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want?
Suppose, unless there's something else, the planning board should adjourn.
Yeah, I think so.
Is there a motion?
Move that we adjourn this meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
No discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes 4-0 at 8:04.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys
Thank
hanging
you.
around for the later, for the traffic thing, or is that Sheila? I don't know. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sheila. Okay, next on the agenda is an update from Cadillac Paint by Nobis Engineering. And do we have a representative here? No, okay. What's that?
Yep.
Okay, do you want to identify yourself?
Sure. I'm Adam Roy, project manager with Nobis Engineering, and I'm here to provide an update on the former Colonial Lacquer and Cadillac Paint brownfield property located on Elliott Street in Ashland. We call the site both Colonial Lacquer and Cadillac Paint, so I apologize if I flip back and forth between the two. It's been called both throughout the history of the site. Colonial Lacquer is how the DEP refers to it, so we tended to try to stick to that, but they're one and the same. I'm going to walk folks through a brief site operational history, a summary of the historical investigations, historical remediations, a summary of the recent work Nobis completed out there in 2017, and I'll probably try to provide just kind of a brief overview of the human health and environmental risk assessment work that we've done out there, and talk about some of the proposed remediation work we think will help the site move forward towards redevelopment. Site operational history. The site operated as a paint and chemical manufacturing facility for approximately 50 years, from roughly 1937 to 1987. There was a very large fire in March of 1977 that destroyed the main manufacturing building, which was subsequently rebuilt, and operations resumed till about 1987. There's been a lot of work done out there. There's a number of environmental investigations that were performed from approximately 1986 through our recent work in 2017. It included a lot of soil sampling, a lot of groundwater sampling, several ground penetrating radar surveys, sampling from nearby private residential wells. In 1986 through 1987, there was 14 underground storage tanks removed from the property, as well as their contents. These underground storage tanks contain petroleum products that were used in the manufacturing operations at the facility. In 1987, approximately 80 55-gallon drums, these were all empty and crushed, were excavated from a specific burial area on the site. I'll show you that in a little bit later. But it appears those were just empty, unused drums, so they crushed them and just buried them out back where there was room to get rid of them. In 1990 through 1991, approximately 800 cubic yards of petroleum-contaminated soils were excavated, stockpiled, and treated using a bioventing and vacuum extraction system. These were petroleum-contaminated soils that were impacted from releases from the underground storage tanks that were once at the site. The soil was placed in a big stockpile with perforated pipe throughout it, and they basically put a vacuum on those pipes to pull the volatile petroleum hydrocarbons out of there. If you've ever been to the gas station pumping gas, you know how volatile that stuff is and how easily it partitions into the air. So that's how they treated that soil. They did some sampling. It was found to be successful and was clean enough to place back into the open excavation. And then in 1996, the Mass DEP was at the site to do some investigation work, and they removed 22 drums of just residual manufacturing resins that were inside the main manufacturing building that were just sitting there unused, so they removed those from the site. And then again in 1999, Mass DEP contractors removed an additional 3 drums of resin from the property. They also removed 80 gallons of residual oil and sludge from an above-ground storage tank that was located outside of one of the buildings. When they removed that, they also noticed that the above-ground tank that was outside the building had been leaking for probably some time, and they excavated some soil from out of there and removed an additional 4.1 tons of contaminated soil from there. And they also identified an additional 1,000-gallon underground storage tank that contained fuel oil that was used to heat the main manufacturing building. So they removed 485 gallons of residual fuel oil, which was a good move so that it wouldn't leak out just sitting there while the site was unused. So to date, contaminant detected at the site includes volatile organic compounds in both soil and groundwater, semi-volatile organic compounds in both soil and groundwater, volatile petroleum hydrocarbons in both soil and groundwater, extractable petroleum hydrocarbons in both soil and groundwater. All those petroleum compounds and VOCs were primarily associated with the releases from the underground storage tanks. And then there's also been some heavy metals, primarily chromium and lead, that have been detected in soil, and polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, that were also detected in soil. Novus was out there in 2012, 2013. We did a hazardous building materials survey, and we detected there was high concentrations of lead paint on the existing buildings, as well as PCBs in some of the building materials. So we believe that most of the contamination, the metals contamination, PCB contamination, was a result of the main manufacturing building. We're assuming those products were in that building as well, and when the whole thing went up in flames, you had a lot of ash and soot, and fire department spraying water everywhere. So we think that's how most of those contaminants were deposited throughout the site. So during our 2012-2013 investigation, we were performing a targeted brownfields assessment on behalf of the town using EPA grant funding. And we detected concentrations of PCBs in shallow soils at concentrations representing a potential condition of imminent hazard as defined by the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Massachusetts Contingency Plan is a set of regulations that governs the reporting, cleanup, risk assessment, and closure of sites where oil and hazardous materials have been released to the environment. So at that point, there was a potential condition of imminent hazard. Mass DEP got involved, reached out to the US EPA to see if their removal group could step in and help out and try to eliminate the imminent hazard condition at the site. So from 2014 to 2015, EPA contractors came in, did some additional soil sampling to try to delineate the extent of the contamination, and perform some removal of contaminated soil and other materials. And that included 1,700 tons of contaminated soil, 46 tons of crushed drums, 20 gallons of other hazardous liquids from miscellaneous containers that were spread throughout the site, and cleared a ton of trees and brush out there. If anyone's been by the site, you can notice how much clearer it is now than it was a number of years ago. So this is a depiction of some of the historical features of the site and the work that's been done. You'll see these are the main buildings here. This blue area here, that's where the excavation of 800 yards of petroleum contaminated soil was done. These red areas to the left and right of that storage shed is where the underground storage tanks were located. This area here is where the crushed drums were buried. And then these thicker red lines you'll see outside the building, that's where EPA performed their excavation work. And the red and green dots are all EPA soil samples. The green dots inside the excavation areas, those are soil samples that were collected after the removal work was done to document that contaminants had been reduced to the state standards, which is 1 part per million. So Novus got involved with the site again in 2016 is when we started looking at the site again. We looked at all the work that EPA had done, and the thing that stood out to us after conversations with town representatives was that we were hoping to turn the site into a park area, some type of passive recreational area. And the one thing that really hadn't been addressed to this point, if you look at this figure here, is we didn't know what was going on underneath the buildings. So that was going to be important if we removed those buildings from the site. We didn't know what was laying underneath there, so we wanted to get a handle on that. So we collected some additional soil and groundwater samples, another round of groundwater samples from the existing monitoring wells that were at the site. And we primarily focused the bulk of our investigation on areas underneath the building to try to see what potential future risks may be lurking under there. So this is where we performed our soil borings. You'll see all those blue dots, a number of them beneath the existing buildings. And we also looked like there might be some data gaps in the spatial coverage when we looked at some of the historical data points. So we actually went out beyond some of the areas that EPA had even excavated. Make sure we weren't missing anything when we looked at it.
How deep do you go down with those borings?
These soil borings varied in a number of, the bedrock's a little crazy out there, so some of them were as shallow as 4 feet and others were down to 12, 13 feet underneath the building. So, and we collected a number of soil samples in each boring vertically as well, and you'll see those results displayed in a little bit. So we concluded, after our investigation, concentrations of VOCs, VPH, and EPH were not detected above, in the groundwater samples, were not detected above the applicable MCP standards. I'll get more into MCP standards in a little bit. And additional excavation of the contaminated soil from beneath the existing lab building and an area outside the main manufacturing building would be required to achieve a condition of no significant risk under the MCP. I'll discuss that term in a little bit more detail in a little bit. But this is kind of the results of our investigation, the soil sample results for PCBs. What you'll see here is a number of kind of circles within circles. We call those concentric circles. And the smaller circles represent the surface concentration. And then as the circle gets bigger, the deeper you go, the bigger the circle gets. So it allows us to kind of visually display three-dimensional data on a two-dimensional plane. So the bigger the circle, the deeper you are in the soil horizon. So all those green dots there was no PCBs detected above the laboratory reporting limits, which are very, very low. And then the yellow dots are PCBs that were detected above the laboratory reporting limit but below the MCP soil standard, which for this standard we're looking at is the most conservative, and it's 1 part per million. And then the red dots you see there where PCBs exceeded that 1 part per million standard. But when you look at some of these results, it's probably a little tough to see on this screen, but most of our results that were detected above the standard, the red looks a little alarming, but when you actually look at the concentration that goes with it, most of them are pretty low. Like this one down here, you have 1.5, 2.1, 1.6. So the bulk of them were pretty low. There was a few that stood out underneath the lab building and this area here, this RS70. That one's a little high. That was actually a composite soil sample collected by EPA at the end of their excavation, but it was at a depth of 4 feet, and they were only excavating to 3 feet to try to get rid of that immediate hazard in that shallow soil. So those soils underneath the lab building are currently covered by a building, and the ones outside the main manufacturing building there currently have 3 to 4 feet of clean soil on top of them. So they're not really a risk under current use. We're thinking about what might be a risk in the future.
Can you go back to that slide? Just
Sure.
where you were pointing out earlier the burial site.
Yep.
Down below, you've got that red circle.
Yes.
Surrounded by green. What's going on there?
EPA did collect a soil sample from there. I forget what the initial sample concentration was. It was slightly above that 1 part per million threshold. And that green sample you see there, they removed some soil from that spot, and that green sample is a sample that was collected after they were done excavating.
So the red circle, what is?
This circle here down here?
Yes.
That's just the excavation area.
Okay.
Yeah.
So under the main building?
Yep.
It seems odd to me that you have all those greens and that one red.
It is a little bit odd. But again, I think that concentration is pretty low. You remember the main manufacturing building burned and they rebuilt it.
Right.
So I think that some of that stuff got deposited and just pushed around when they were probably redeveloping the site.
Okay.
So when we look at this data, we try to determine, all right, well, what are the risks here? So under the MCP, site cleanup is risk-based. The MCP gives equal weight to the human health, public safety, public welfare, and risk to the environment. They weigh them all equally under the MCP, but we typically tend to focus the most on the human health component. For obvious reasons, we don't want people being exposed to things that may cause them to get sick. So under the MCP, risk characterization, we're trying to quantify the degree of risk posed by a contaminated site. And we're trying to do that through scientific studies, mathematical models, statistics. There's a lot that goes into when you're assessing risk at a site. And risk management, we're trying to specify the degree of risk that's acceptable. And a lot of that is dependent upon site use. If it's a commercial industrial site, you obviously have a little more tolerance for what some of those contaminant concentrations may be, whereas a situation like this, a park, school, daycare, playground, we want those standards to be very, very low because those are our most at-risk people. So under the human risk assessment, under the MCP, we're trying to predict what some of those potential adverse health impacts might be. And we try to look at that and develop what those cleanup standards are. We're not making these standards up. There's a host of standards that are available from Mass DEP to serve as guidance for that process. Just to help further explain this a little bit and what this risk means, this is kind of a basic example of what we call a risk continuum. On the far left, you have no risk. If we all wanted to live at the no risk level, you would basically have to live in a bubble with purified air. We're exposing ourselves every day to chemicals in the air that we breathe, whether it's cleaners at home, gas at the gas station. There's VOCs probably in this carpet in this room, so we're kind of bombarded by this stuff every day. But for the most part, we're at that what we call no significant risk, which is this NSR we've got highlighted here. That's the standard we're trying to achieve under the MCP, is no significant risk. So when you think about that 1 ppm standard that I referenced earlier, that's what DEP has set as a threshold for no significant risk. And when you start getting above that, health effects, it's largely dependent on the individual. It's why someone like George Burns could smoke 6 cigars a day and drink 5 martinis and live to be 100. And for some of us, we certainly wouldn't make it that long. So, and on the far end, you've got death and That's definitely where we don't want to be. So under the MCP, and most of us in our day-to-day lives, we're living right in this little window right here. Yep, average person under average daily conditions, you know, occupational stuff set aside. And under the MCP, there's 3 distinct methods to assess risk. Method 1, which is what we're looking at using for this site, is the most conservative. It's the highest degree of certainty, and it's the most conservative, and it allows for direct comparison of exposure point concentrations, or EPCs, to soil and groundwater standards that are established by Mass DEP that are considered to be protective of human health, the environment, and public welfare. There's a lot of science that goes into these standards. Mass DEP takes these things very seriously. A lot of those guidance that they get comes from EPA. And if the EPCs at your site are less than the established standards, you've achieved that condition of no significant risk. Well, you might be asking yourself, what is an EPC? An EPC is the average concentration of a specific chemical at a contaminated site. So what we're doing is we're trying to look at this site as a whole. Thinking under a future use of a park, you may have someone that's walking through some nature trails, riding a bike, maybe you sit down to have a picnic lunch. We're trying to get a sense of what the potential risk may be from the site as a whole. What might someone be exposed to? So when we looked at our data, we compiled all our investigation data as well as the EPA data, and we looked at it, and there was a couple problem spots that were popping up that were bringing our exposure point concentrations to above what is considered a condition of no significant risk. It was pretty obvious where the problem areas were, underneath the lab building, and then this area here where EPA contractors collected that one big composite sample. This concentration down here was 12.1, and then we had a high concentration underneath the lab building of 26. So those numbers were much higher than everything else we saw on the site, so they were driving that average concentration up. So we looked at it and said, well, what happens if we remove those soils and those concentrations are now gone? And what we found was, over here on the left, you have the Method 1 S1 soil standards. These are Mass DEP's most conservative standards. Concentrations below these standards are acceptable for any use. Could be anywhere, daycare, playground, park. It's the most conservative soil standards they have. And what we found is when we excluded those hotspot soils, we had PCB concentrations that were less than half of the established standards. Lead was more than less than half of the established standards, and then chromium as well. And over here on the far right, Mass DEP does have some published background values for what they would consider you could expect to find in natural soil in an area you would expect to be clean. And those, we are actually less than the standard for lead, which is 100, and then we're only slightly above for chromium. So we think if you remove those soils, we're going to be at a point where you can document that there's a condition of no significant risk. And then the big question is always, well, what is it going to cost to get us there? So we put the estimated building demolition cost at somewhere between 100 and 200,000, and then the soil removal, and this includes you removing that 1,000-gallon UST and all the associated reporting to achieve site closure at 100 to 150,000. I will say the bulk of those costs come from the disposal of the PCB and lead impacted soils that are beneath that building. There's probably only a total of 30 yards total to be removed out of there, but because of the nature of the contaminants that are in there, it's got to go to really special landfills that are, there's only a handful of them in the country, so it tends to get pretty pricey to dispose of that stuff. Unfortunately, it's not quite as cheap as petroleum is, but overall I think it's still pretty manageable as far as a remediation cost. So I guess I'd open it up to any questions at this point.
Steve?
So a question on, you mentioned the use of the site.
Yep.
So, we're projecting a park. What if there were hardscaping portions of the park? Would the analysis become different?
No, not necessarily. I mean, if there was like some paved areas or
Either paved
patio
areas,
areas.
or let's say a
No, not really.
playground
We
area?
would still look at the site and say there's the potential for people to be walking essentially anywhere on the site, regardless of hardscape or not.
Michael? Thanks, Adam. This
Yep.
was very informative, and I think I think everybody will be pleased, or is pleased, with the results that came out of the report. I just wanted to ask a couple specific questions. You know, this was a paint and lacquer company. Are there any, was there any evidence that, you know, actual solvents or paint was actively dumped on a certain area or certain concentration?
No, there's nothing that indicates it was dumped. It was primarily releases from the old underground tanks. You know, when they put these tanks in back in the 30s and the 40s, they were old single-wall steel tanks, so they rust and corrode over time. So there's releases from that. The recent groundwater sampling data that we have, there is some residual contamination in the groundwater, but it's not above the current standards. There's under the MCP, you have 3 different ways to classify your groundwater. There's groundwater 1, which is basically a drinking water standard, which doesn't apply to this site because no one's drinking the water at the site. And there's no private residential wells located within 500 feet of that limited groundwater contamination area. We did confirm that with the DPW folks. You know, we got a map. There's actually a figure in the report that kind of shows that outline. And the groundwater 2 standard is based on the potential for vapor intrusion into an indoor home or occupied structure. And since there's no occupied structures here, and there doesn't sound like there's going to be any occupied structures in the future, that category goes away as well. So you're left with what's considered groundwater 3, which is Massachusetts considers any groundwater has the potential to discharge to surface water. And we're well below those groundwater 3 standards.
Great. And the last thing I wanted to just ask for clarification is, so you would put on the screen there were certain background levels that Mass DEP had established, and we're actually in a couple of those categories under the threshold.
Yep, you are for lead, and we're just slightly above it for the chromium standard, but you know, we're well below what that method 1 soil standard is for risk assessment.
And for the people at home, I mean, background just means like what you could go out if you
dug
at
if
your
you were
soil
in your backyard where there's no suspected release, you know, you wouldn't expect to find contamination. You would expect to find some of these natural elements. You know, PCBs, obviously, those are man-made materials, so there is no background value for those, so to speak. But you can see where if we remove those soils, you know, we'll perform additional sampling after you remove that stuff. And document that it's clean.
Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A quick question. Did the standards change if you wanted to use that property for animals?
For animals, house like grazing?
No grazing. To use it, let's say, as a dog park?
No.
So the standards would stay the same?
The standards would stay the same because you're going to have people there.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yep.
Thank you.
The people are what drive the risk assessment for the most part. The MCP gives equal weight to them, but we're mostly focused on human health because that's generally what we're addressing first.
Thank you.
I just had, would there be any difference in terms of the expense of the cleanup? Would it be different if it was going to be developed for residential or commercial uses? How would that impact?
For if you were to develop it for commercial, you would probably, I mean, could probably get away with doing less cleanup a little bit, but I forget what the commercial standard is off the top of my head. But as far as residential, no, you would still have to meet that standard.
So, and in terms of, so if we're looking at it for, say, a park, and you've got 2 very localized areas of soil contamination, right? Did you look at the alternative of just covering them with some sort of impermeable layer or some
We did. We looked at the cost of that, and while it might be a little cheaper on the upfront cost, you're going to have to file a deed notice and all that. You're going to have to maintain that cap for forever, in perpetuity, and make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to and it's not eroding. And we just thought it made more sense since it's such a small volume. It's pretty manageable from an excavation standpoint. Once the building is demolished, the contamination is shallow. It's pretty easy, and we thought you'd just be better off to just get it off site.
And there's no ventings of any requirement?
Nope. No. The materials we're looking at, the PCBs and the metals, those are not volatile substances. So.
What's the estimated volume that you'd have to remove? How many square feet?
We've estimated like 30 to 40 yards total between the 2 areas.
Anyone in the audience that has a question for Mr. Roy? Could you come up to the microphone, sir? And identify yourself, please.
John Augustinelli, 40 Tudor Lane. On the top left, the yellow, that's under
Yep.
one of the buildings, right? So the buildings will have to be removed prior to removing the soil?
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And how did you come up with the estimate to remove the structures? Because it sounds like a big number coming from a builder. Thank you.
We actually met with a demolition contractor that's done some work for Novus previously on other jobs at the site, and they actually thought that was a pretty conservative number. I think if you were to put that out to bid, you'd probably get a pretty good range of estimates. I'm sure you could do a lot better than the 200,000. I wanted to put in conservative numbers.
And this would go out to bid, right? So
Yeah, this would go out to bid. And I want to say, first of all, we've already appropriated $110,000 at town meeting for this work. So we did that in May for the upcoming fiscal year. So, part of that money has already been appropriated. Representative Lewis has inserted $50,000 in the FY18 state budget for this work as well. We'll see if that survives conference committee and the legislative process. And then there's also opportunities for grants, whether through mass development, DEP, or some other state agency, which I think we would actually have a very good chance of receiving, based on what we're looking at doing in terms of remediation, and then also what we're looking at doing in terms of a future use. So
I would also think we could try to do some fundraising once we start figuring out what we want to do there to help move the process along. We have found that this town, if there's a project people are interested in, especially if we can get some other matching grants, that they are very willing to donate to support things that move us forward as a community.
That's
so
correct.
That's something we need to look at as well.
Steve?
So where do we stand, Michael, with the whole lien process, or the current ownership? What's the status on that?
Well, I think it's better to address two administrative issues. In addition to the lien, there's also the idea that we would need to get a covenant not to sue from the Attorney General's office. And then after we actually looked at this report, we found out that we might not even be eligible for a covenant not to sue, because a covenant not to sue is this extra element of protection for the municipality in case something bad happened. So it was a way to shed some level of liability off just in case something did happen. We feel, Attorney Mead and I, after we looked at this report and looked at having conversations with Adam and Novus, that we might not even qualify for a covenant not to sue because the site would be so low. In terms of the lien, so the property owner owes about $700,000 in back taxes. There is a lien on the property through a couple of different mortgage holders. What we would be looking at doing is either taking the property through a tax title foreclosure process, or what we could also explore having that property donated to us from the current owner, with the contingency that the lien holder would need to waive and release that lien. So we would be looking at both of those options, and hopefully have one of those, determine which option we're going to choose within the next few months, and then execute that over the course of FY18.
And I guess we're assuming that there's no potential for recouping any of that money?
I think it's very minimal,
okay.
if any, if any.
But we definitely want to make sure the town has ownership of the property before we put any other money. I mean, it's good
Correct.
to know what we can do there, but before we do anything else, we need to have ownership of the property.
Yeah, I mean, we can't do it from a legal standpoint. Also, we wouldn't want to do it from a practical standpoint. Right. We don't want to clean up somebody else's property that they could then go and
Turn around and do something
Yeah.
with. Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Good, thank
All
you.
right, thank you very much, Mr. Roy.
Thank you.
Great,
Great
thank you.
Very
presentation. Great to
informative.
have the information.
Okay, next on the agenda is a discussion of designating veteran spaces with Mr. Ryan Puzo and Mr. Dimitri Karpouzis. And I apologize that we're running a little bit late to you gentlemen, but
How you doing?
Hey, Dimitri. How you doing?
So, my name's Dimitri Karpouzis. Good evening. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak. The purpose of my visit here tonight is to propose a concept that a nonprofit organization that I belong to has devised. Rifles to Rods is a 501c3 nonprofit organization and devoted to the transition, recovery, and well-being of veterans in their struggle with PTSD. Unfortunately, so our founder, Ryan Puzo, Joe can probably attest to this, before you have something to do or 5 minutes before the end of your shift, you get a call. So that's unfortunately where he is right now. So I'm here kind of representing the nonprofit and Ryan. A little bit about Ryan. He served in the Army. He was deployed to Afghanistan, and fortunately he returned as a combat vet. And like most veterans, Ryan struggled with PTSD, and he made some choices that most veterans do to try to cope with it. Ryan was lucky because he had a friend that dragged him out of his house and brought him onto the water, and he took to it immediately, which is kind of the concept of Rifles to Rods. We provide fishing as a therapeutic outlet to aid veterans with their transition back into society. We have them focus on a skill set and the tranquility of the water, coupled with other like-minded individuals with similar experiences, all in an outdoor setting, and it provides an alternative coping mechanism to combat with PTSD and a means for healing. As a civilian, I have not only had the privilege to work alongside with veterans in the police department in Ashland. Ryan and I work together. But I've also, on random occasions throughout the course of the day, I have more of an opportunity to meet veterans. One thing that I've noticed since I was a kid versus now is how many veterans and the age range of the veterans. So while on patrol, part of our job is traffic enforcement, which includes parking. And what I've noticed, with parking, we focus on handicap and fire lane. And what I've noticed is veterans have a plate, a very distinct license plate. And I've seen young and old veterans walking through parking lots, great distances, and some with visible impairment. Now, they may or may not meet the criteria for a handicap placard, but no less deserving of a closer spot. So, on behalf of Rifles to Rods, what we'd like to propose is a veteran parking only sign. We suggest that they be placed nearby handicap spots because they're usually found closer to the destination. And it'd be a nice gesture of gratitude for their service. The signs can be placed on various spots throughout town, spots designated obviously by you. We would provide the sign for you. We would place it for you, on locations of your choice. Now, working with the PD, we wanted to remove motor vehicle violation from the equation. So I sat with my superiors and we looked through all the scenarios and possibilities, and they've come up with no discrepancies for designated spots. You could designate a spot for just about anything. We came up with just a rough idea. I can pass this on. And it's just a thought, of course. Changes are welcome, And so anyway, what we'd like to do is get Ashland on board with it, designating several spots, putting the signs out there for veterans. And, well, to be perfectly honest, I kind of want Holliston and Hopkinton to go and Ashland beat us. You know what I mean? So I really like to be kind of first for that. Our hopes, though, to be truthful, is we start a trend and get other towns to kind of jump on board and designate spots. You know, it'll be a win all around. That's what I have. Thank you.
Any questions for Steve?
So, just thinking about this, I mean, it's a great idea, no question. But thinking about a couple of things. Number one, we've got 4 locations basically where we control as a board.
Okay.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Town Hall, Municipal Lot, the Community Center, and then the library. Is there any other parking lots that we, and I'm not talking about on-street parking, but I'm talking about lots per se? Well, the school's not really under our purview, so.
So you could say, I mean, there's a couple spots at DPW that are
Okay.
designated. I
All
mean,
right.
anytime, any place that there's a municipal
Okay.
building.
So have you and Ryan thought the next step of locations and so on, and
So because it's the town, we're kind of at your mercy. And
Okay.
if you picked one spot, it would be better than none.
so that's, again, there's a variety of locations here.
Yep.
And I would suggest, a place like the community center, I mean, there's a lot of veterans that go there on a regular basis, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the seniors are veterans and so on, so I don't know how you just designate 1 or 2 at a place like the senior center. But,
Sure.
That's another discussion. But again, I think it always goes to the enforcement of, the whatever that
Right.
bylaw or that decision is. And so, I mean, that to me is going to be a secondary challenge.
Right. So just discussing it with my supervisors and superiors, they usually a veteran is designated with a particular license plate. But even if they don't have a license plate, when you see like compact car parking only, and you see a tractor trailer pull in, it just, what can you really do? Somebody wants to park in a veteran spot and they're not a veteran, that's,
I'm
hopefully
going to
the big guy's
suggest
not watching
that
that.
on Saturday,
Yep.
there's 2 spots in the municipal lot that are designated for the charging station.
Mhm.
Guaranteed that they're going to be gas-powered cars.
Correct.
Sitting in those spots.
Correct. Yep. Hopefully, they're empty when we get a veteran that needs a spot.
Yeah.
And that's really all we
people
can.
would have a little more respect.
I would hope, I'm just,
Yeah, and believe me, we thought the same thing.
Yeah.
Because you do see, even handicap spots that we do enforce, we see people that park in them all the time. And
So I think you're thinking about this as kind of like an honor system, because, of course, there's a lot of different definitions of veteran, so it's almost like, if you get real legalistic about it, there's
Right.
like 6 different classifications, but, so we're just looking at people that really think of yourself as a veteran, kind of the general term, and it's almost kind of a self-designation, it
Correct.
seems like, from what
Yep.
you're saying.
this is more of a gesture, to, again, provide a spot that's a little closer to where they're headed. And I've seen young and old walk, and I just, sometimes it's like, you just parked so far away. I'd love to see them closer. And again, it could be someone that has an impairment, but he not meets the criteria. It could be someone that, served, but medals and this and that, you can't really kind of compare. But if they're a vet, we'd like to say that they have a spot.
Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dimitri, you just mentioned something briefly about the fact that there are many veterans that don't have the specific veteran plate.
Right.
So if they see that sign and they know they themselves are veterans and they park there, how do you make that distinction? Because, if you're going to enforce it,
right,
you write the ticket and you drive off because you have other things that you're doing.
Right.
The vet comes back, sees and says, and loses his mind because
Very true. Yep.
he was cited.
Yep.
So, I mean, would there be any contingencies with respect to that?
We really wouldn't enforce it. It's not per se enforceable. Best case scenario, it's parking in a non-designated spot, but it's not really enforceable.
I think part
where-
of the beauty of this is that it doesn't get overly complicated.
Right.
You know, I mean, if you start getting legal about it, it gets complicated.
Correct.
And then you have that confrontation out in the parking lot where a
Yeah.
vet that has a plate is ready to pull in, or there's another car there that doesn't have that.
Right.
And then they come back and there's a confrontation out in the parking lot, so.
Yep.
Well, I
I'm
think-
just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, but I think that we should maybe view this as a positive gesture
Oh,
instead
absolutely.
of a
Absolutely, and
worst-case
I'm-
scenario.
Right.
Negatives.
Yeah, oh, and I'm not, but I'm just saying, in human nature, it's gonna take over.
True.
I guess what I would suggest as well, and have you talked to like Shaw's or Market Basket?
So I did.
With their corporate folks, because that would be CVS Pharmacy, I mean, a lot of these private, parking areas.
The obstacle that we faced with places like that, and we did approach them, Market Basket, Shaw's, is when they do something at one particular store, they have to do it across the board.
I
And
would think
it's
that
a
was-
win. It's a win all around.
I
but
agree.
Yeah, and for them, where they sometimes have Employee of the Month or something like that, they designate a spot. We proposed it to them, but sometimes it's received, sometimes it's not. We kind of looked at the town. When we drive and work for the town, it was to us, it was almost like a no-brainer. Like, geez, I'd really like Ashland to show support versus, either a business. And hopefully, Joe, it becomes contagious.
Right.
And Shaw says, oh, they did ask us about this, let's do it too.
Like you said, it'll
That's what I
domino
was-
effect will
Yeah.
continue.
That's what I was thinking, that if we set a precedent, maybe other people would follow it.
Right.
Right.
And maybe the state would pick up on it as well.
As long as we beat Holliston.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
guess-
honestly.
I guess my suggestion for potentially moving forward with this is, maybe to work with
Designate
the
some
town
spots.
manager to designate,
Great.
locate some spots, come back to the board, and we can review them that way.
That would be
Well, if
awesome.
not the town manager, we have our traffic study group.
Well, that's traffic. This is parking.
I would suggest that maybe
Okay.
going with Mike would probably be, it'd be quicker.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, understood.
But not quick.
I said
Right.
quicker, right, quicker.
I would suggest that, Mr. Carpuzis, that you work with the town manager with this and bring it back as soon as possible, and so that we have something to vote on.
Something to
We usually
approve.
don't vote on things like this the first night that they're presented.
No, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to pitch it.
Well, it's a great idea.
Thank you for bringing it forward.
Thank you. No, I
think it
appreciate the
is-
time.
Okay,
it's
Thank
a
you very
good
much.
thing.
Thank you,
you.
Dimitri. Be safe out there, brother.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on, we have the consent agenda. The minutes from April 19th, May 17th, the surplus school boards at the park, and a letter of support to the Mass Lottery Commission to allow Bingo to relocate and operate in the town of Ashland.
Before.
I'm sorry?
No,
He was joking.
I was making a reference to bingo.
I
Do-
move that,
Motion
I ha-
to
oh,
approve
thought
the
you'd want
consent
C.
agenda as presented.
second.
Any discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Nice to have him back in town.
5-0. Okay, next up is old and new business. A request to amend Condition 9 of the development agreement with Campanella and Thorndike with regard to the rail transit district with regard to traffic. Mr. Herbert.
Yes, so this is in reference to Condition 9 of the development agreement that you signed back in September of 2015. And actually, that condition was a carryover from the original permits that were issued back in 2008, or the original development agreement back from that time period. What we found as we started getting into this project is that the current language in Condition 9 is not really the best for the town. Specifically, it talks about issuing $50,000 to the town for to do some traffic studies and to do some traffic work, and that was to be issued upon the first occupancy permit. Also, it's while they're doing some work in the MBTA access road as well. So what the proposed amendment is to actually change that, change those obligations from when the first occupancy permit is issued to when the 200th occupancy permit for the apartments are issued.
And the rationale for that was?
So the rationale for that was that it makes much more sense. You can measure what the traffic impacts a lot easier. Well, you can actually see what the real traffic impacts are when you're halfway through the project from when you're actually just starting the project.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so,
Yolanda?
and I sent these, and I don't think you got a chance to respond to me, Michael. As we were looking at, and this is more specific to what they're gonna be doing at that intersection and the redesign of it, and from what I could see, there was no information or no notations about crosswalks or how we're using the sidewalks, how it's gonna tie into the multi-use trail that's coming down that road. And I would think that if we're taking the opportunity and they're taking the opportunity to repurpose and redo that intersection, that we would wanna look at all those things as part of it.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're redesigning it and expanding it, is so
Okay.
that we can maintain those,
Okay, so that will be
multi-use path.
part of the design, and as they go forward, they'll look at that.
Yeah, part of the problem is when the road was designed, it was designed to complete street standards. And so when you got to that intersection, it got it narrowed so much that you wouldn't have enough lanes to accommodate the traffic. Queuing from 135 into the MBTA access road, and also queuing into Dunkin' Donuts as well. So that's one of the reasons for the change.
Okay.
Any other questions? We have the town planner here and the chairman of the planning board. Do you have anything that you want to add to this?
Preston Crowe, Chairman of the Planning Board. We've discussed this at length with the Planning Board, and the Planning Board agrees that the reworking of the traffic mitigation going forward appears to be the right thing from the planning perspective.
Thank you, Preston.
And
And-
just, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
just to follow up on Yolanda's point, so in terms of the bicycle path and all that, that design is gonna be taken into account and allowed, because I was looking at that intersection in the picture, and it looks, oh, sorry, yeah, 1 foot away. I was looking at the intersection, the picture looks like it could be a difficult intersection with Voyager's Lane and all that, so.
According to the trail map, it's a challenging intersection.
Ah,
It's got
there
a
you
big
go.
circle
I think the
there.
problem is that the routing of the trail and figuring out exactly where the trail is going is coming more after this project is complete. So there may eventually need to be some reworking there, but we're probably 3 to 6 months behind the ball on that at least, and the design has already been done as far as I know.
Well, the other thing is, even if the trail isn't there, though, you do have the bike trail on the access road already, and with complete streets, you'd want, regardless of where the Upper Charles Trail goes, that trail has to go somewhere rational. It has to be able to cross the street and that kind of, thing.
Yeah.
So that's something that, just wanted to make sure that gets handled, so.
Well, that it seems to me that would be impacted in a positive way by going through the amendment process. That
Sounds
would have
like it.
more accurate data to analyze with
I
regard
agree.
to all of
Yeah.
these things. Thank you, Preston. And Sheila, are you?
I just wanted to clarify that the design of the intersection is the design of the lights, so the timing of the intersection. It's not the physical intersection.
Oh, okay,
Is what Campanelli Thorndike is responsible for.
okay.
And DPW is on board with this?
Yes, so this is all in the packet. This was determined after a task force of the town planner, the DPW director, Doug Small, and also Campanelli Thorndike's consultants.
But the citizens don't have the packet.
No, you do.
Okay, do we need to vote on this tonight?
Yes. Yes, you need to vote on it and sign it. So vote to accept to amend the development agreement as presented.
Okay, do I hear such a motion?
Yep, I move that we amend the development agreement as presented and discussed.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye. No.
Opposed? Okay, that carries 5-0. Okay, next is local area unit application and regulatory agreement for the Cirrus Apartments, which again are the Rail Transit District apartments. Mr. Herbert.
Sure. So there's a number of ways to, or a couple of different ways to get affordable housing units on your subsidized housing inventory list. One's through the comprehensive permit process, and then the other is through this local initiative program. And to qualify for that, you have to establish what the parameters are for the affordable units, what the rents are, what the obligations are. And so this is the regulatory agreement that defines all of that and needs to be submitted to DHCD. So the town and Campanelli Thorndike must apply to DHCD together. So that's what we are asking here.
Okay, any questions? Discussion?
No, I think we've done this before.
Okay, so do we need to take a vote on this as well, Michael?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would word the vote to apply jointly with Campanelli Thorndike to DHCD to enter into the regulatory agreement for Cirrus Apartments.
Okay, do I hear such a motion?
Sure, I move that we apply jointly with Campanelli and Thorndike to enter into the regulatory agreement for affordable units.
Second?
Is that correct?
Do I hear a second?
Second.
And then I would also ask if you would vote to authorize me to sign any subsequent documents related to
And
this.
authorize Michael Herbert, our town manager, to sign any documents related to this.
Okay, do I hear a second?
Say a second.
Okay, any further discussion?
Nope.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that's 5-0. Okay, next is the adoption of a code of conduct for public officials and visitors code of conduct. We have in our packet 2 examples that town council put together. There has been further discussion in the presentation for the charter review. There were recommendations in that had at least a reference to some kind of code of conduct. And Mr. Mignani had also submitted an example of a code of conduct to us as well to consider. And so what I would suggest doing, unless someone feels otherwise, is wait until we have our discussion with regard to the recommendations for the charter review, and then adopt a code of conduct that's consistent with that discussion, and have a section of the charter that references the code of conduct, but the code of conduct would be adopted separately.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to put that discussion off until we have the discussion about the charter review, unless someone has a problem with that.
No problem with deferring the code of conduct discussion, but I'd like to offer, I think, a parallel discussion regarding, how we vet our appointments, that process.
Well, that is part of their
Charter
suggestions as well.
Right, but I think we should, because we'll probably be making appointments between now and if and when we adopt changes to the charter.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's reasonable for the Board of Selectmen to adopt maintain a vetting process in a sense.
Okay.
Not onerous, not very much different than what we do, but something that's, I think, a little, maybe a step or two beyond what we do. So I would just offer that as a parallel activity.
I don't disagree with that, Steve. I think it's a good idea. I think that maybe we can bring that up as a topic as part of our board retreat.
Joe and Yolanda? Robert and Yolanda?
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah,
good.
I think that makes sense. I would also say that at a next liaison, we, at least get this information or beforehand to the school committee to let them know that we're looking at this.
Oh, yeah.
If they have not heard about the report from the charter review committee, because they do make some appointments as well, not as many as we do, but they also have subcommittees and other things that appoint to them, that they appoint. So I think it would be good for them to know that we're thinking about this and at least let them weigh in so that they have some input as well?
Right, and in the charter review, it also specifically states that
Right.
the school committee will abide by those types of, appointments and
Right.
recommendations as
But
to how the
it's always good to let them know
Oh,
that we're thinking
absolutely,
about
and I
this.
believe that,
So-
I'm pretty sure that Roberta has, but if we can follow up on that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
hold off.
we'll move on to the next item, if
Yep.
that's okay. Okay, D, under old new business, is adopt a new evaluation criteria for town council. This is something that we talked about last year at this time, because council's appointment expires at the end of June. And we had talked about doing this, having a little bit more stringent vetting process to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of our representation. And unfortunately, we didn't get to it until now. But I think in your packet you have some criteria that Steve put together. What I would like to do tonight is vote on accepting the criteria, and then we can submit those between now and our next meeting, and then discuss the reappointment at the next meeting. Any comments?
So just a little clarity, I guess, regarding the draft. This is a draft, and as you can see, part of it's modeled after our town manager's evaluation process. So there's a rating scale that's included. We would have to obviously do the proper formatting and the proper, presentation when we submit it to the board. Carl?
Okay.
Well, do you think, so basically, but each one of these standards we're gonna put a number on, basically?
Well, this is a draft. Let's talk about it. The questions are really designed to have a descriptive, a narrative. We don't have to have a numerical component here. It can be a narrative, and so it's really up to the board to. I just included the rating scale because we use it with the town manager.
What I like about combining narrative and numbers is that for some people, they can put a number in, and then if they're not comfortable putting a narrative, and it's also more quantitative. You can look at it and say, based on the numbers, this is how we rated the town council, but then also using the comments as well to give feedback and things. So I'd like a combination of the two, like you did, Steve. I think it's good.
Joe, Rob? Comments?
No, I think I agree with what Yolanda just mentioned with respect to Steve's combining the two together. Providing a written comment that also helps support, your skill rating. As to why you did it and why you thought it was important enough to do it. So that's I like that addition to the eval.
The only comment that I would make, and it has nothing to do with adopting this, but it has to do with the accompanying email, is the input from the other boards that council works with, and which I think is important. But at the end of the day, this is our appointment, so I think it would be in everyone's best interest to speak with members of the other board, the chairs of the Planning Board and the Conservation Commission and the ZBA, to get input, but not necessarily. I wasn't sure if you were suggesting that they have an active part of the evaluation, or it should be incorporated into our individual.
No, I think, I guess I was speaking, I guess, from my perspective, because it's typically, I would choose to go out and get other, solicit those opinions. But, I think it's, again, I think you make the correct point that this is our appointment. We get the information, and then we can each individually, rate this. And it's kind of interesting when I did speak to Lisa about this, and I asked the question as to whether other communities do this sort of more formalized evaluation, and they don't.
Well,
but
some,
that's not.
some
I'm sure they do.
In her sphere,
In her sphere, yes, but I'm sure they do. But I think this is good. We only make 2 appointments, the town manager and town council, and I think this is, this is a pretty modest evaluation, given the scope and scale of what they do.
But I think everyone benefits from this. I think that, I think council would benefit from this as well.
Yeah, Lisa had absolutely no, she hasn't seen this, but we did talk about the concepts and so on, so certainly no issues. I would just suggest if we do adopt this, Michael, I can work with somebody to do the formatting, or, you can do the formatting, have someone do it. We need to do it, I guess tomorrow.
Can I just bring up a fact that, on something like this is the first time the board has had the opportunity to discuss it, and we usually don't vote on it the same night. So if the board decides that's what they want to do, it'll be something that we've taken out of context of things that we've done in the past.
I think that we don't have a whole lot of choice here if we're going to use this as an evaluation, because we have to vote on.
We have a time restraint.
Yeah, reappointment at the next meeting.
Okay.
So we could use the old format, or we could adopt this. I mean, this isn't particularly cumbersome, and I think it's important. I think it's something that we can do if the board chooses to do it. I realize it's a little bit out of the ordinary procedure, but if the board's willing to do it, I think it would probably be beneficial to everyone.
So basically what we'd end up doing is going through this and, assuming the format doesn't change, which sounds like we don't really have time to change much, so.
Well, we're not going to change any of the questions. All we're going to do is format it so that, you would have a scoring slot here
For
and
each
then a
one,
narrative
So we
slot,
can even
right?
use this and do it if we need.
You could.
Yeah.
And then if you could get it to me, as
You'll
soon
need
as you
time, yeah.
complete it, and we'll compile it for the next meeting.
Yeah, I think given the schedule, that's what, and thanks, Steve, for putting this together on short notice. So I think given the schedule, this is probably our best alternative.
The only other thing I was gonna say is, because this is late, and to Joe's point, we usually don't vote something like this and then use it right away, but, we can still do an evaluation of town council and decide if we want to appoint them, and then put this in place for next year, if that's something people are comfortable. If not,
Or
I
we
could
could-
do either one.
We could,
But-
I would suggest doing this for this year, and if we want to amend it for next year, sometime during the year, that we could do that.
So we'd have time to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
All right, then,
Well, then, what I would suggest is, so that they don't spend a lot of time reformatting this, I would feel comfortable putting numbers next to this.
Yeah.
Just let us use this form if we vote this in tonight, and then we can tweak it based on our use of it this time, and then reformat it. That's what I would
I don't
suggest.
think it'll take a long time to reformat it, just really kind of putting a slot for a number, and then, but also space for a narrative as well, because otherwise you're gonna have
There is
to
some.
add, paper.
Right, it'll be a separate page.
Yeah, so I think if we just, create a block like we do with the town manager, you have the formatting for that
Right.
already. I think we
I'm just
can-
trying to think, we have that in Word or.
It's in
Yeah, I think we
believe
can
it's
just
maybe-
pop this in and just use the same format.
We'll see, we'll see how quickly we can turn it around, because the time is of the essence
Right.
on this,
Right.
if you want to
Yeah.
use it for
Like
your
I said, if you
evaluation.
can't
And
turn
worst
it-
case, if it doesn't work out, we'll
We
just use
just do
that.
it like
Use
this,
that one,
yeah.
right.
Because we have this, can we, because this is a separate Word document, right, that you created, Steve?
so.
I did.
Okay, so as long as we have that.
We all have one, right?
Yeah.
And we also have, right, we could also just fill these out and hand them in.
I was just gonna say that, thank you.
all right, so do I have a motion then to accept the new evaluation criteria for town council?
I move that we adopt the new evaluation criteria, with our thanks to Steve for pulling it together, to use for this year's review of town council.
Okay, do I have a second?
I'll second that. And
All in
Steve wants
favor?
the second. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, 5-0, thank you.
Thank
you,
you,
Steve.
thank you.
Stephen.
Okay, the next thing on the agenda is the creation of a planning liaison committee to include 2 members of the Selectmen, the Planning Board, the ZBA, and the Conservation Commission. And Steve, do you want to comment on this?
Sure.
This was your
Yeah.
suggestion.
Sure. And actually, Preston, if you can come up, because, and I probably should have asked the board when they were sitting, but, this is something we talked about probably a couple of years ago within the Board of Selectmen, and it's You know, I guess the concept is modeled after the liaison committee that operates for the budget. You know, the schools, the finance committee, and local government. And it's more of an informational tool, not a decision-making entity. But, you know, I guess I'd like your opinion and input about, you know, how, if it's advisable to have, you know, let's say a quarterly meeting between those entities, and just to have kind of that information sharing, you know, particularly when we have a lot of these projects that have become, you know, controversial, or they've been contested, or there's, you know, so lots of information going on, and different boards doing different pieces. So I guess, you know, from my in my mind, it makes sense. I don't know if it makes sense to.
Oh, yeah, I certainly like the idea. Anything that has more communication between the boards in the town is almost always a good thing.
Okay, so the challenge is that, you know, we're all busy people, and
Yes,
you know,
we
we're
are.
throwing another committee out there.
Exactly.
And is it, and then we're also talking potentially about having staff that are, you know, also very busy. So again, the practical aspect of that. I mean, is it 2 members? Is it 1 member? So I guess I would ask, you know, certainly ask you to go back to your board and ask their opinions about this. But, you know, if you think it's a viable.
If it's only meeting once a quarter, that's not a very big ask. I think we can do that.
But talk to your board.
Yes, yeah.
I would say talk to your board,
I said
yes.
think. There's a wiggle word there.
And we haven't, you know, Carl certainly, as a member of the Concom, will go back to his board, and, you know, I can certainly reach out to ZBA and to see what kind of level of interest there. But, you know, Michael, I know you and I have talked about this, you're concerned with staff, and, you know, I can get that. I think it's, if we're looking at it more as a information sharing, and if we do need specific questions answered, we can ask at that point, rather than, you know, having this litany of staff people. So I can understand that.
Any other discussion?
So just a couple of comments. I would, I mean, I think this is a good idea as well. I definitely recommend 2 members of each board. One of the other things we found with liaison is we have found a consistent time, and sometimes then whoever is on the board or whoever is the appointee will change because that time doesn't work for them anymore, rather than getting everyone together and saying, okay, when do you want to meet? I mean, you might want to do that the first time, but by having 2 members, if one can't go, you at least are represented by one. And certainly if it's quarterly, I think there's a good possibility that that can happen on a regular basis.
Quarterly.
And Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve, I appreciate the thought and idea. I just have a concern that, again, you mentioned it a few moments ago, creating another committee. And here we go again. We'll create more committees, and people are pretty well spread out as it is already. I guess my concern would be if you have a group of individuals that work in our management team that have weekly meetings with certain boards throughout, and staff throughout the month or whatever period it is, that they could go through a checklist and make sure that, you know, the planning board is made aware of what the discussion's going on, the ZBA as well, Board of Selectmen as well, any of the ones that you have listed down here, Concom. I mean, so that way everybody has the same communication information provided to them. So that way you do have that information, instead of creating a committee to make sure that that's done. I think we have staff that can do that and meets on a regular basis with a lot of people already. So maybe a checklist worksheet during these meetings to make sure that everybody is notified and is signed off on. We'll probably just do would probably suffice and do exactly what you want done without you know, interfering with everybody's other personal lives. That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
But
Well, I'll give you an example as to why I think something like this might be different than that description. And let's look at you know, a lot of the discussion that's going on around 40Bs. And I think it's fair to say that you know, 40Bs are adjudicated by the zoning board, but, you know, I think we all have opinions about 40Bs and concerns about 40Bs. And, you know, the way we, we've authorized a lawsuit regarding a 40B, right? And I think there's those sorts of things where there might be, it might be advisable for these various entities to have some common ground, and if we're pursuing particular actions, either legally or with our legislative team, to me it makes sense to have this kind of communication.
Well, I think the agendas that these boards present and put on, then post on our website provides that information, so if somebody has a concern, that they go to those meetings where those issues are being brought up and discussed.
Well, I'm not talking about, I'm talking about, let's say we as a board want to go out and I'm going to relate this to our joint Board of Selectmen meetings, where we've started to talk about, this regional concern about 40Bs.
We haven't really.
No, we haven't, I know that, but that's been expressed as a concern. And I'm just suggesting it's there's a common theme that seems to be developing with that. And just, again, Joe, it just seems not specific to a project, but this is now specific to an attempt to maybe change the legislation or pursue changing the legislation. Maybe pie in the sky, but that's the way I see this potentially, this kind of communication. So,
I think from my perspective, I certainly get the idea. Of better communication, and everybody I think does that, gets that idea. I'm torn for the same reasons that you guys are discussing here. Time concerns, benefits versus those type of things. I don't know if there are other issues that we might want to discuss before we agree to do this. Maybe we could bring in the opinions of the town manager and the assistant town manager with regard to, they're the ones that have to manage staff. And from my perspective, A, they do a good job, but B, it's overwhelming sometimes the amount of stuff that comes through town hall. I mean, sometimes you just get knocked over just walking through town hall trying to deal with all of the things that are going on here. So is there some kind of way that staff can keep the various boards coordinated electronically or something like that, where we might meet in some kind of emergency situation like you referenced with regard to 133 West Union Street or something like that? I would suggest that we give it some more thought.
well, absolutely. I'm not, certainly wasn't suggesting that we adopt this tonight or pursue it. Obviously I'd like to hear more from Preston's board, ZBA, the Concom. I mean, it may or may not be viable, but it just, it's. I think we talk enough about all the moving parts and sometimes the lack of coordination and communication.
And I don't think anyone disagrees with that. Yolanda?
Well, I just want to say, Steve, what you just described in regards to, like talking about a 40B issue is not what I got or what I envisioned this, because like when we talk about what liaison is between school, finance, and selectmen, it's talking about the issues in town, how can we coordinate better, how can we, do the budget process. So when I saw this as a planning liaison, that's what I saw it as projects are coming up, so that if you aren't someone who, checks the agendas and say, oh, they're talking about 133, if there is this sort of planning liaison where it's 2 members, then whoever's on this board for the selectmen could come back to our board and report on things. Or planning board could go back and say, okay, the selectmen have discussed this, so, which is very different to me than talking about a regional change. So it could be a combination of the two, but.
Exactly. So it wasn't, again, it's throwing an idea out there to
further discuss
and I don't think it's not a bad idea.
And then to flesh it out with more definition, that's all.
Okay. Well, we are running a little bit late, but I'm going to allow Kathy to comment.
No, nowhere near 10 o'clock, Carl.
Yeah, well, I have to be on the road at 6 tomorrow, so my comments will be brief.
Okay.
Sure.
Kathy, identify yourself.
Kathy Rooney, 136 Fountain Street. So I'm hearing 2 things here. and what Joe just said about the checkoff list, I've been asking for years now in town, so that the committees, as stuff goes through the committees, they know where a project stands. That's the basic. But the other piece that I'm hearing here, I'm thinking back to that meeting at the community center over our favorite rail transit district, where it seems like we're caught flat-footed in the town on a regular basis by the large impact of certain developments, and we're behind the 8 ball. So if we had a liaison planning committee between doing these things, and maybe with a couple of at-large members from the citizenry, we might actually be able to better assess the impacts to the town ahead of that curve and get ahead of it, so we're not always knee-jerk reacting and dealing with people screaming and yelling about all kinds of stuff. And that's what I look at a committee like this. I say, you know, it's another committee. Oh my God, there's thousands of them in town. But the flip side of that is you get ahead of stuff, and we might actually be able to get developers to do what we want them to do in town.
So to be fair, what I proposed here has really no definition to it. It's just a concept of a liaison similar to the budget liaison.
Right, but you guys use that as a planning committee to proactively get your ducks in a row and make sure that you're not, you know, suggesting spending money on a new school building when you have another one you could reuse, or some other building. I'm not suggesting that at all. But you know, as I look at this and I go, wow, that's a great idea to proactively get ahead of the developer curve and get some of the things we want done in town done. That's how I see it. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I would
Kathy.
suggest only that, you know, if there's interest with the other boards, that we pursue it, that's
Okay.
all.
Yeah.
Just a couple of comments. That I believe the checklist system is being developed. I know that it's something Jen and the Planning Office and the Conservation Commission has been working with as far as streamlining that process a little bit better. And I think that we all agree that getting our heads around planning is important, and we're doing that through the strategic planning that Michael's putting together. So, but I would agree that let's have a further discussion.
The only thing I just wanted to add to that, and I think this is a good idea, that this planning is one of the biggest things we get involved in, at least informally as a board, and I think it is a good idea to have this kind of communication system if someone's going to kind of report back, you know, on a kind of a routine basis. And it may not need a ton of staff time, maybe little or no staff, actually, if members or meeting can just update, you know, what is an important project that's going on and what do they see as the issues. And you could simply bring it back. And were you thinking it'd be quarterly, or had you gotten that far?
I was, actually, Michael and I had a conversation about this, and I thought we talked about quarterly, right?
Yeah. So that might even be good enough to just, you know, just periodic updates, like this is what Concom, this is what I hear from Concom or ZBA or planning as the big issues, and just kind of a quick one to make sure, to go to Joe's point, I don't always check all the agendas to see what else is going on in other boards, but if I come to this meeting, if something's important going on, I expect that someone will bring it up and we can discuss it. So
Well, I would suggest that there's a, you know, we ponder it, and, you know, if there's an appetite for it, then we put some more definition to it.
Michael?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you know, to Rob's point, is something that wouldn't necessarily need that much staff time. But I think one good example of where this could be helpful, or some increased level of communication would be helpful through whatever format, is the development off of Olive Street, that in some way or shape or form, you know, it's come before the Board of Selectmen in terms of the stop signs, you know, on Olive Street. That had that kind of trickled, had a trickle effect into the planning board's deliberations, I believe, as to what they decided to do. So again, I think it's beneficial. I think whether it's through a liaison committee or some other format, I think everybody's in favor of increased communication.
Absolutely.
And it strikes me, and also your periodic development list is part of that we're doing now. But, you know, again, that's just a periodic kind of update. So.
All right. Well, I think we all agree that we will consider it again after deliberations from the other boards and committees.
Good. Thank you, Preston.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Preston.
Okay, next on the agenda is to select dates to meet in July and August.
Oh, boy.
Why are you looking at me there? I almost called you Mr. Chair. You know, let me say, you know, everyone knows that Joe and I grew up. I am so glad to not have to call you Mr. Chair anymore.
Well, hold on a second. I'm kind of glad that I don't have to call him Mr. Vice anymore. Right? Just want to let you know.
All right. I'm not sure who has
Are we
what
looking to do one meeting each month?
Well, we were, and I also wanted to try to schedule a retreat tonight, if that were possible.
Okay.
The dates that are good for me overlap with the dates that are usually school committee nights.
Oh, okay.
And they are the second Wednesday in July and the second Wednesday in August. And I don't think that that's an insurmountable problem. I just don't know if anyone else has conflicts on
That's
those
the
days.
12th, July 12th.
So you're looking for
I can't do July 12th.
So the 19th, so the 12th is a Thursday, so isn't...
No, the 12th
No,
is a
12th is
Wednesday.
Wednesday.
The 12th is the Wednesday.
Oh, is it? Okay,
Yeah, so our normal nights would be the 5th and the 19th in
Okay.
July.
right.
Does
I'm
anybody
a
want to
bit-
meet July
those-
5th?
This is a...
What's that?
Does anybody really want to meet July 5th?
I'm
It's
around.
okay with me. I mean,
No, sure, I only say that because, you know, it's right after the holiday, but
It's a
it's the
work day
begin-
for
right.
those of us that work, so it's not a...
Whoa.
Wow.
Boy,
Point of
that's a
order.
slam, yeah.
Shoot me through the heart.
That's the second hit you got
Wow.
tonight. I think I gave the first.
I could actually do the 5th. I didn't think anyone would want to, but if
No,
that's a
maybe the
date
5th
that
is
works for
available.
everyone.
The only reason why I didn't suggest it at first, because it's the beginning of the month, and who knows what's gonna happen, you know, for the
Right,
rest
I mean,
of the
that
month.
would be the other thing.
true.
That's the only
How
drop.
about the
5th
19th?
The 5th of July
That's our
we're looking
usual.
at? Okay.
And the 19th
the
would
5th
work for
work
me
for
as
you?
well.
The 5th and the 19th are fine with me.
Same here.
Okay,
Yeah,
let's,
5th works.
okay, why don't we go with the 5th?
Okay,
Okay.
5th of July and August.
August.
Oops. So normally we'd,
The 2nd and the 16th would be our regular dates, so.
And those aren't good for you, Carl.
I could do the 2nd.
Do the first
I
week
can't
of each
do-
month, and then if anything comes up, and
Yeah.
we'll
So
play
that
that
work
second-
for everyone?
Yeah.
August
I think
2nd.
the
August
second's,
and-
the second's no good for me.
Second's no good for Rob.
I think,
Okay.
let me just double check.
Second's no good for Rob.
Wait a minute.
He's probably on a world tour.
Pretty sure I have that down as a no. I prefer the 16th, but that doesn't work for people.
Doesn't work for me. What is the one between the,
the 9th,
That's the night, then the school committee meets that night,
well,
hopefully.
they might be adjusting their summer schedule, we don't know.
does the 9th work for everyone?
Actually,
Yep.
You want it?
Check.
The 9th, no, the 9th is no good. The 2nd is probably better for me, August 2nd.
August 2nd, okay.
Okay.
So July 5th and August 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
All
very
right.
good.
That
Yeah.
sounds good to me.
Okay, and I would like to put together a retreat for the Board of Selectmen next Wednesday evening from 5 to 9,
Yep, that works.
if that works for everyone.
Yeah.
So let's,
Is that June?
15th,
15th,
14th, no,
14th?
14th. Wednesday, June 14th.
June 14th.
Okay, 5 to
Okay.
9. And we're going to try to do the Warrant Center, is that correct, Michael?
yeah, we'll try to get the Warren Center.
Okay, and if we can't get the
You
Warrant
just do
Center, then I guess it
downstairs,
would be...
or the,
Downstairs.
could do the library, or
The library's a possibility.
there's that
Would-
small room in the library.
Yeah, the Achiever Room, that's nice there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Possibility.
Nice cushy chairs.
Yeah.
I mean, we've traditionally held it at the Warren Center, and I'm happy to look into that and see if that's available.
We've also done it at the fire, the police station.
Yeah,
We've done
well,
it
I don't know. I think the Warrant Center is kind of relaxing, and I think
Sure.
relaxing is not a bad thing for the retreat.
Session.
Yeah.
Sure, whatever,
And if it doesn't work
On my
out, then we'll
calendar,
consider
let us
the
know
other
where.
things.
So June the 14th, 5 to 9 at the, right now, the Warren Center. And then we got, what, August the 2nd is our August dates, okay?
Okay.
We'll get those summer dates to WACA.
The retreat
so
is
they can-
basically about the charter, right? Plus,
Well,
Dates to
you wanna
WACA
talk
for
about that?
summer meetings.
For summer meetings, yeah.
Thank you, Susan.
reviewing our missions.
oh, right, the usual. That.
Okay, old new business G is review complete streets policy. Michael, do you want to bring us up to date on that?
Yeah, this is something we looked at actually a couple of years ago. And actually, since we've put this on the agenda, we've confirmed that Sheila Page and Doug Small are actually going to be attending the training related to Complete Streets. So what I would suggest is that we actually put this on for the next agenda, have them come back and give us some updates as to what they learned, and maybe put forward some updates to the policy as well.
Okay.
Yeah, because the next thing really task is to appoint this committee, it sounds like.
Well,
Complete
if
Streets.
that's, I mean, if that's the direction, you know, you want to go, I know there have been some policies that don't have a group, or it's,
Oh, really?
and just use it as a staff function, and which then comes and
Okay.
reports back to the road commissioners, which in this case would be the Board of Selectmen.
So these guys
and
are,
board-
one of the things Sheila and Doug are gonna do is look at how other people,
Exactly,
other age
exactly.
And when are they
municipalities
doing
do it.
this?
I believe it's next week. I want to say the 12th.
Okay, so that, we could potentially then put that back on the agenda for our next meeting?
The 21st.
Mhm.
I don't think for the retreat, I think, you know, I think you would want to have it for the meeting, our regular meeting on the 21st.
Right, after they've gone to the training.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Okay, is that okay with everyone?
Yep.
So
Are we
just,
gonna have, I'm sorry, Mr.
That's
Chair,
okay.
will we have either Doug show up to provide information as to what they?
Yeah, I'll
Sheila.
ask Doug and Sheila to attend. Yeah, because I think it would be important for them to brief you on what.
Yeah, no, it
Well, we may have to
sounds
hook Doug
interesting.
up out in the parking lot. He's on record as feeling more comfortable in the parking lot than at the podium, so.
okay, we'll get them trained.
He's going to one training. We'll get him to another.
Yep. Yolanda?
So just real quick, and I know I've told you guys, unfortunately, I will not be at the next meeting. Unfortunately, I have an unexpected trip that I need to take. But just, Complete Streets is something that, again, I had gone to a meeting, and it's the kind of thing where I've really been pushing to get someone trained, because by us having a policy and us having people trained, it then allows us to apply for grant money for some of our projects that we're trying to do, including our trail potentially, some of the intersections, some of the downtown work that we're trying to do. So I'm very interested in, when we voted this before, I know we need to do another vote just to clarify it. But I won't be here, but I would just like to state now that I strongly support Complete Streets. I strongly support that we do what we can to get this going. And if there is a committee that we do decide to create, I am interested in being part of that as part of some of the other transportation items that I'm working on. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Do we need to adopt this? Is that why you're
No,
you're
we're
just briefing
waiting.
us? Okay.
Yeah,
Until they
to
come
the
back
next
from
meeting.
training.
Okay, very good.
So, town manager reports, the corner spot, Mr. Herbert?
So, just thought I'd give you a brief update on the corner. Is Beth still?
No.
Okay, Beth. A brief update on the corner spot. As you can tell, there's been a lot of activity going on over the last few weeks. The shed has arrived. The storefront has arrived.
That's good.
The storefront.
Oh, storefront.
So, we've also had a number of volunteers led by Kathy Rooney doing some plantings out around the perimeter. Baseline Builders has been busy building the pergola and also the shields.
The sun shields,
Yeah, the sun shields.
The sun shades.
And you know, I'm pleased to say that we're actually looking at having our grand opening on June 28th at noon, I believe.
Noon, it will be the ribbon cutting.
We'll have a more formal ceremony with the ribbon cutting, and then we'll also have, we're looking at putting together a program later in the evening that's more of a community-wide event. We have a number of businesses that are going to be going into the storefront or utilizing the corner spot, including the Coffee Trike, Fireflies Barbecue, the Ceramics Garage, Sweet Home Handmade, and then Jennifer's Soaps, not this Jennifer. She says make so.
Will there be a schedule up as to when each business is going to be there that we can publicize?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Put that together. And, this has really turned into a really great community thing. And there's a number of people that are really pulling together to make it happen. I mentioned Kathy, a number of volunteers, of course. Beth's been leading the effort. We had a number of volunteers planting, I think too many to really articulate and name individually. Dave Iarusi has been donating his time as a plumber. We also have our facilities crew that have been helping out with this, and also our DPW crew. They've been out doing some work as well. So, again, it's been nice to see everything kind of come together and everybody kind of pulling together for this great community concept. And
Do they have their next planting date by chance?
don't think they have.
No,
any-
not yet, but they will have some future planting dates.
Yeah. Is there anything you wanted to add, Jen?
No.
Okay. So.
I mean, there'll be a second round of business, so that's the other thing. Right now, we have businesses through mid-August. And so as we're hoping that businesses sort of see this as a community project and that there's some community support, we can then do some additional businesses.
Is there a scheduled time for these? Are they specific weeks that they're scheduled right now?
Yes.
So fireflies.
Second week.
Yes,
So it's
June 7th through 13th.
July.
Or July.
July. Yeah, so the coffee trike will be at the kickoff and then do the first week. It's a
Very cool.
Nice.
Remember, there was a time when you thought I didn't like to talk too. So, just saying that. So.
When I was a kid, we used to have something in Ashland called Home Guard, and the corner spot would be a great place for Home Guard.
I don't know about that. We won't. Home Guard is exactly what it sounds like.
Oh, yeah.
Offline discussion.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, boy.
Yeah, the good old days.
Good old days.
Okay, is that it, Michael, for the
That's
corner
it for the
spot?
corner spot.
Okay, and B is the downtown engineering update.
Yep, so just wanted to give you an update. Steve and Yolanda, Sheila Page, Jen, myself, John Rossi, and Dale Buchanan, 2 members of the planning board, interviewed 3 different firms to do our downtown design and engineering. We ended up selecting BSC Group out of Boston. I think across the board it was a pretty easy, I think, decision just in terms of their preparation and the way they presented collectively, holistically. I think they did a great job. So we moved into the next stage of the discussion, which was to talk about a price proposal. It came in a little bit higher than what we were originally anticipating. It came in at, well, ultimately, after all was said and done, $185,000. That's the bad news. That's about $100,000 more than what we had anticipated. The good news is that we also had another project that we appropriated money for back in the fall, which was to do the work at the landfill, the venting work at the landfill. And fortunately, the bids for that work came in $100,000 under what we were expecting. So very coincidental. So it ends up being a wash. The downtown work is on our capital plan, so I feel comfortable moving it up and doing this work. And so what that includes, because I know it's a significant amount, it includes things like the startup and data collection, doing the field survey and all of the base plans, doing the project area assessment and analysis, looking at landscaping, traffic operational analysis, looking at complete streets and pedestrian bicycle assessments, putting together a parking inventory and analysis, looking at relocating the overhead wires underground, and then also putting together then 3 plans, 3 potential proposals for work, one being the preferred plan. And then also looking at things like financing, how we could finance this in the future using district improvement financing. And then finally putting together that 25% design, which is going to be important because that's going to contain cost estimates as well. And so those are the documents that we can utilize to then go out and look at getting things like grants, like MassWorks grants, things of that nature that we could utilize to help fund this project as well, so that taxpayers wouldn't have to fund it. So I'm pleased to say it's looking like it's going to move forward.
Good. So I was just going to comment that, you know, they did put together a terrific written proposal, and then, you know, they also did a very good presentation as well. What I liked about them particularly was that they were, you know, there's a scope of this particular project, but they were willing to look at, you know, how this gets tied together to other sections of downtown. So, and they had done a lot of homework. I mean, they you know, had you know, they had gone through reports. I think they had certainly a much better sense of downtown than, or Ashland in general, than the other two firms at this point. So, right.
And the planning board feels the same way, I'm assuming?
The two members of the planning board felt it was unanimous across the board. They really had done their homework. When we were asking questions, they had slides really prepared to help answer. They had anticipated a lot of what we would ask.
Yep, it was interesting because one of the other firms that came and gave us a proposal was a firm that we're working with on Route 126, and because I know them, I really was considering, okay, we're going to use this firm again, but BSC just came in, and you can tell they had really done their homework to, you know, show us that they wanted to work with us and to do this project. It was very positive.
Well, it's nice to see they put the effort into it.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Good.
Michael, you just mentioned the House Street landfill and how something is costing us less money there.
Yeah.
Can you give us an update on what's going on there and when we're considering, when we think that'll be done and the rest of the screening and things like that might get put in?
Sure. So there's two separate issues that are going on at the landfill right now. The first is the solar project itself. And then the second thing is something that emerged over the spring, which was an issue with methane gas. They're not related to each other, but they are impacting one another. What we needed to do once we had elevated levels of methane detected through some of the monitoring wells is we had to get DEP approval on a design to mitigate that methane. And so what was developed was first a permeation trench, and then we came up with an alternative way of doing things, which is just more of a passive ventilation system as well. So that's what the funding is for that I referred to earlier, is to do that work. Until that work is done, we can't put the berm up to provide a lot of the screening that was part of the project. In terms of the solar project itself, I believe it's right now with the planning board. I believe they're awaiting a site or a special permit. Correct me if I'm wrong, Preston. A special permit from the planning board for Amoresco to do their work, or a site plan modification, it might be. Preston could probably give a better update about where
the reason I brought it up is I saw some questions about why is the berm not done, why is the screening not put up yet. So,
my understanding from the planning board side was they were waiting on the landscaping because of the mitigation for the vapor leakage.
Okay.
And once that's done, then they should do that. And their other issue is getting the interconnect with Eversource. The planning board wanted them to not put up new utility poles. And they were going to pad mount, and Eversource says you can't do that. They said, well, what if we put the pad up on a berm? Eversource said no. And I said, well, but we can't put up poles because then you're going down below the 12 inches that we've got approved for. And the way the special permit decision was written by the planning board, it says that they can't put up power poles unless the planning board agrees that it's a good solution, essentially. I don't have the wording in front of me, obviously.
Okay.
So they don't have to come back for a modification of the special permit. They just have to get agreement from the planning board for how the interconnect is designed. And last I heard, they were still working on that.
Okay.
I think they're actually looking at getting some easements to put the interconnect on some neighboring property.
That's correct.
That's the last I heard.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
And that's going okay, or anything we can talk about openly, or?
No, I mean, they're looking at a couple of different options for alternative
And
properties.
Who's they, Amoresco?
Amoresco, yes.
Oh, interesting, okay.
And you can't blame this one on the beavers, right?
That's true.
Okay.
I had another question for Mike about something else over there, if that's all right, Mr. Chair. unless you-
Go ahead there,
Well, just-
Mr. Vice Chair.
Did you want to follow up on your email about the housing production plan? Anything else you want to?
No.
So-
No, just it's something that we're working with the, I think actually Attorney Mead referenced it today, something that we're working with DHCD on.
Yeah, and you think there's some hope that that'll change, or?
I do hope that'll change, yeah.
This is the,
Okay, board reports. I'm assuming that somebody's going to be able to tell me when the farmer's market starts. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Anyway, Mr. Mignani, board reports.
Oh, we're changing the order.
Wow.
Yeah.
I do. I have a couple of things I'd like to bring up to the board. This past weekend, I had the pleasure of representing this board, providing 2 wonderful scholarships to 2 deserving recipients. They were Nick Featherston and Kelsey Collins received scholarships from the board. They were very surprised and very excited about receiving the awards. A couple of things that I was kind of concerned about, and I waited a couple of days to see if there was going to be anything in the Metro West Daily News, and there was not. And there was the lack of coverage of our graduation at Ashland High School.
No.
Every other town received coverage except the town of Ashland. And I waited till today to see if there was anything in the paper, because sometimes
No
they're like...
photography, no nothing?
Nothing. There was absolutely nothing. So I emailed Mr. Adams, who had the same concerns, and contacted the Metro West Daily News, and the response that they got was the Metro West Daily News stated that they had no reporter to cover this event.
Believe it. Yeah.
Wow. That's not acceptable. One, to me, that's not acceptable. That's just my personal opinion. This was a great event. Every other town, there was like 5 or 6 different graduations that day. And they all were represented except Ashland. Are we going back to that old way that Ashland gets booted every now and then because of whatever reason? And I hope it doesn't. I hope it doesn't. But anyway, just that's my soapbox thing for the night. But other than that, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that the Snack Shack is open at the Pavilion Monday through Friday from 11 to 1, and that our summer concerts begin on June 27th. And the first one is the Bobby Watson Blues Band. So if you like rhythm and blues, come on down, because they're a great band. And let's just hope that we have some nice weather to keep it going forward. And that's it, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Thank you again for those nice accolades, but it's not deserved. I appreciate it, though. But thank you.
We take them back.
Okay, you can take them all back.
Yolanda?
So, Joe, thank you for attending graduation on our behalf. It was an honor for me to actually go through all the applications and to choose who our scholarship recipients were going to be. It was not an easy choice. All these kids are so deserving. They all work really hard, and they had some really good information that they presented. So thank you, Joe, on that. I was fortunate to attend, it's called Box. It's a morning program that's held at the Mendez, and it's a movement program where the kids come out for about a half hour, 40 minutes before their school day and exercise. It's been going on for a year or two. They're trying to figure out how they're going to incorporate it next year when they change the time of the Mendez. But I applaud the group who runs it, because, again, getting kids moving before they go into school, they're just going to learn that much more. I also had a Pond Street working group meeting where we had the consultants in, and we were starting to look at lighting pole choices and some of the things we discussed, and I made sure that we looked at having both brackets for flags as well as signs so that we can continue our sign project on Route 126. I attended I'm part of an MMA policy group now. One of the updates that we got was regarding the hearings that are going on at the State House regarding their determining their steps to create their committees and things like that. And there's discussion to try to get, instead of just a 3-member committee, make it a 5-member cannabis committee similar to the liquor board. and try to have some municipal representation on that board. And then there's the advisory council, which is about 15 members, which currently, based on the law, is going to be 8 to 10 members from the industry, and they're trying to change that and also get municipal representation on those boards, so that as they're making decisions, there's input from the municipal governments that are trying to organize and run and manage this whole new industry that's happening. And that was it.
Thank you. Steve?
Well, the one thing I am not going to talk about is the Ashland Farmers Market, which just happens to be opening this Saturday, 9 o'clock
You
at
say.
125 Front
You don't
Street.
say.
So
They're all expected to be
we
there.
have a great, we have a great lineup of vendors for opening day, and we have some guest speakers to open up the season. So that's this Saturday, June the 10th, and I think there's some electronic signs out there that are flashing away, so.
Letting people know.
So the other thing, just a couple of other activities that have been going, that have occurred and will occur in next week. The community center has received a couple of, a grant to do intergenerational projects. They had received these grants through an organization called Bridges Together, and there was a presentation done, a completed project that one of the intergenerational groups had done with a pollination garden behind the community center. And it was a terrific, Michael and Jen were there, it was a terrific presentation, and they had a storyteller, they had snacks. It was very, it happened to be a lousy day, rainy day, so we really couldn't go out and enjoy the pollinating bees, but it was very, very well done. There's a second project that will be presented next Thursday at the library, intergenerational interview process, and I think I discussed this in the past, where we had a group of high school students interviewing a group of seniors at the community center, so that should be an interesting reception as well. And then the last thing is there is a shingles clinic at the community center on June the 13th. I think most doctors recommend getting shingles shots after the age of 50 maybe, or 55. But that's available to the public. I believe, is that through the state that is providing the vaccine, right? So that was it. And did I mention the farmers market?
I don't believe
When
you
is
did.
it, Steve? When is it, Steve?
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Rob?
I don't, nothing to report. I know, I'm following your footsteps. Yeah.
Wow, Rob. I would just like to thank the board for this past year, all of you. I think that we accomplished a lot, and I think that when we go on our retreat, you'll probably be surprised that we accomplished this as much as we did, but we still have a long way to go. And so I thank you for your work in the past year, and I thank you for your support going forward. And if you could get the town council evaluation forms back to me as soon as possible, that would be good.
Great.
And that's all I have as well, so. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Thank you very much, and
Preston.
good night, everyone.
Second, Preston, absolutely. God bless, guys.